Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and history takes the scenic route through the stranger corners of our planet. Tonight, we're going beneath the sands of Egypt, not into a royal pyramid glowing under the desert sun, and not into the painted tomb of a pharaoh with golden treasures waiting in the dark, but into something colder, heavier, quieter, and in some ways more puzzling. We're going to the Serapeum at Saqqara, a place of long underground corridors, shadowed chambers, sacred bulls, polished stone and granite boxes so massive that they seem to invite one very simple question. How did anyone make these things? Now, Egypt is not exactly short of mysteries. It has pyramids, obelisks, hidden chambers, missing tombs, unfinished statues, carved temples, star alignments, and enough ancient paperwork to keep scholars happily busy for several lifetimes. If history were a house, Egypt would be the attic where every box is labelled important, fragile, and possibly cursed. But the Serapeum has a different feeling. It does not overwhelm you with colour or gold. It does not show off with painted ceilings or graceful columns. Instead, it waits underground with enormous stone containers sitting in rock-cut rooms, each one dark, heavy, smooth, and silent. They do not explain themselves. They simply sit there, as if someone left behind a question too heavy to move. The usual explanation is clear enough at first. The Serapeum was the burial place of the sacred Apis bulls, animals connected with the god Ptah at Memphis, and later associated with Osiris Apis. When one of these bulls died, it was treated with great ritual care, mummified, mourned, celebrated, and eventually placed in a stone sarcophagus deep beneath Saqqara. That part belongs firmly to ancient Egyptian religion, and it is strange and beautiful enough on its own. Imagine a society where one living bull could be watched, honoured, examined for special markings, housed like a divine guest, and buried with ceremonies worthy of a king. We modern people may find that unusual, though we should perhaps be careful before judging too harshly. After all, we have birthday parties for dogs, social media pages for cats, and heated opinions about whether a hamster needs a tiny sweater. But then there are the boxes themselves. That is where the tone of the story changes. Some are made from extremely hard stone, including granite and other hard igneous stones. Some are often described as weighing many dozens of tons. With their lids included, some estimates and popular claims push the total weight toward the kind of number that feels less like furniture and more like a small building. They are not little coffins gently carried under one arm. They are huge stone monuments, shaped, hollowed, polished, transported, lowered, and positioned inside an underground complex. And when people stand beside them today, they often do not ask first about theology or symbolism. They ask about tools, because granite is not a forgiving material. It is hard, grainy, stubborn, and not especially impressed by copper. If you have ever tried to slice a crusty loaf of bread with a spoon, you have at least the faint emotional outline of the problem. Ancient Egyptian craftsmen certainly worked hard stone. That is not in dispute. They drilled it, carved it, ground it, polished it, moved it, and turned it into objects of astonishing beauty. Mainstream archaeology explains much of this through a combination of copper or bronze tools, stone pounders, tubular drills, saws, abrasives such as quartz sand and possibly harder materials, patient labour, clever organisation, and enormous amounts of time. This is not a weak explanation simply because it lacks a glowing machine in the corner. Ancient people were not primitive. They were skilled, observant, practical, and very good at using simple tools in sophisticated ways. Still, the Serapeum has become one of those places where the discussion refuses to stay tidy. Engineers look at the surfaces and wonder about tolerances. Tool enthusiasts look at ancient drill marks elsewhere in Egypt and argue over feed rates, grooves, and abrasives. Alternative researchers point to smooth interiors, straight edges, sharp corners and heavy lids, then say the old explanations do not quite cover the whole story. Some even claim that the marks preserved in hard stone suggest a cutting method more advanced than hand-powered copper tools and loose sand. Others go further and speak of ultrasonic machining, vibration cutting, lost energy systems, and inscriptions that supposedly describe an unknown power source. At that point, the conversation begins to wobble between archaeology, engineering, speculation, and the sort of late-night documentary question that makes you sit up in bed and say, "Wait, what did they just say?" So tonight, we are going to move carefully, not cynically and not gullibly. Somewhere between those two is a much more interesting place to stand. We are not going to declare that every polished surface is proof of a forgotten super-civilization. We're also not going to wave away every difficulty by saying, well, they just had lots of time, as if time by itself can pick up a 60-ton box, polish the inside, and slide it neatly into a chamber while everyone watches with a packed lunch. The better question is not simply whether ancient Egypt had lost technology in the dramatic sense. The better question is what kind of technology we may have lost the ability to appreciate. Was it a machine, a method, a craft tradition, a supply chain? A combination of abrasives, pressure, water, leverage, geometry, and trained hands? Or is there something in the stone that still has not been properly explained? Before we go farther underground, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Are you somewhere warm, perhaps with the window open and the evening air drifting in? Or somewhere cold, tucked under a blanket while the rest of the house gets quiet? And if you were standing at the entrance to an ancient tunnel beneath the desert, would you want to go in first? Or would you politely allow someone else to discover the spiders, loose stones, and possible ancient engineering puzzles ahead of you? There is no shame in being the second person into a mysterious underground passage. In fact, there is wisdom in it. History may favour the brave, but knees and elbows often favour the cautious. If you find this kind of slow journey through ancient mysteries soothing, intriguing, or simply useful company while the day winds down, I would be very grateful if you gave the video a like and subscribed. It helps this small corner of calm reach other curious minds who may also enjoy drifting through history, science, and the occasional, suspiciously well-polished block of granite. And as always, I hope the story is interesting enough to keep you company, but gentle enough not to keep you awake. If you do fall asleep somewhere between copper saws and sacred bulls, that is perfectly acceptable. The Serapeum has waited for thousands of years. It can wait until morning. To understand why this place causes so much debate, we need to picture it properly. Saqqara sits not far from Memphis, the ancient capital, and it is one of Egypt's great landscapes of the dead. The step pyramid of Djoser rises there, one of the earliest monumental stone buildings in the world. Around it stretch tombs, temples, shafts, causeways, broken walls, buried chambers, and layers upon layers of human effort. Saqqara is not just a site, it is a long memory made of limestone, sand, and ritual. People returned to it for centuries because it mattered. It held ancestors, kings, officials, animals, gods, and the promise that death was not simply an ending, but a passage into another form of order. The Serapeum belongs to that world, but it hides much of itself below ground. Its galleries were cut into the bedrock, with corridors leading to chambers where the Apis bulls were buried. The idea of burying sacred animals may sound unusual if we imagine ancient Egyptian religion only through pharaohs and pyramids, but animal cults were deeply important in different periods of Egyptian history. The Apis bull was not just any bull. It was understood as a living manifestation connected to divine power, especially Ptah, the creator god and patron of craftsmen in Memphis. That last detail is quietly interesting. Ptah was associated with creation, making, forming, and skilled work. And here, in a burial place connected to Ptah's sacred animal, we find some of the most discussed stonework in ancient Egypt. It may be coincidence, but it is the kind of coincidence that sits down beside you and gently clears its throat. When the Serapeum was rediscovered and excavated in the 19th century, It entered the modern imagination as both an archaeological site and a mechanical puzzle. Early explorers moved through dark passages with lamps, measuring rods, notebooks, and probably the firm belief that Egyptian sand gets into places sand has no right to be. They found great stone sarcophagi in side chambers, many broken open, many emptied long before. The original burials had been disturbed, robbed, damaged, and stripped of much of their wealth. What remained were the tunnels, the inscriptions, the fragments, and those enormous containers. The missing treasure made the stone itself more noticeable. Gold can distract the eye. Granite makes you ask how. A stone box of this size is not one problem. It is many problems stacked neatly on top of one another. First, the stone has to be quarried. If it came from far away, as much Egyptian granite famously came from Aswan, it had to be separated from the bedrock using tools and methods available at the time. Then it had to be shaped on the outside, hollowed on the inside, smoothed, polished, and prepared for a lid that also had to fit. Then it had to be moved across land, perhaps by river for part of the journey, brought to Saqqara, manoeuvred near the site, taken underground, and positioned in a chamber where space was limited and mistakes would be rather inconvenient. Dropping your keys behind the sofa is annoying. Misplacing a multi-ton granite lid in a narrow ancient tunnel is a different category of afternoon. Mainstream archaeology does not deny the difficulty. It explains it through known ancient methods, large workforces, sledges, rollers in some contexts, levers, ramps, lubrication, careful planning, and the use of abrasive cutting. One important point is that copper does not need to be harder than granite if the copper is mainly holding or guiding abrasive grains that do the cutting. In that case, the abrasive is the real worker, and the metal tool is more like the patient assistant keeping everything in place. Quartz sand is hard enough to abrade many minerals. Corundum and emery are harder still. Experiments and microscopic studies have shown that ancient craftsmen could drill and abrade stone with methods that seem simple in principle, but require skill in practice. A rotating tube, abrasive slurry, pressure and time can do things that look almost magical if you only see the finished hole, and yet certain questions keep returning. How precise were the Serapeum boxes really? How flat are the surfaces? How square are the corners? Were the interiors polished to a level that would have required special tools? Or do they show the marks of grinding and finishing that we would expect from labour-intensive methods? Are the claims about machine-like accuracy based on careful published measurement, or on photographs, impressions, and the understandable awe of standing beside something enormous? This matters because mystery can grow very quickly in poor lighting. A smooth granite wall seen by torchlight can become a laser-cut miracle by the time it reaches the internet. On the other hand, dismissing every unusual mark as ordinary without measuring it carefully is not much better. Good questions deserve better than quick answers, whether those answers are conventional or exotic. The claim of ultrasonic cutting is one of the more dramatic ideas attached to ancient Egyptian stonework. In modern industry, ultrasonic machining can use high-frequency vibration and abrasive slurry to shape hard materials. The tool vibrates rapidly, abrasive particles strike the surface, and tiny bits of material are removed. It is especially useful for brittle, hard substances. To someone looking at ancient stone with regular marks, smooth cuts, or strange grooves, the comparison can be tempting. Perhaps, they say, the Egyptians had a way to vibrate tools. Perhaps they discovered a mechanical principle later forgotten. Perhaps certain marks in granite are not saw marks at all, but the fingerprint of a lost process. That is an exciting claim, but excitement is not the same as evidence. A real case would need measurements, repeatable observations, tool mark analysis, comparison with known ancient methods, comparison with modern ultrasonic machining, and a clear explanation of where the energy came from, what the tool was made of, how it was controlled, and why no unmistakable machines have survived. Ancient Egypt left behind tools, workshops, unfinished objects, quarry marks, texts, art and debris. A lost technology does not need to leave a complete machine with a helpful label saying property of the Royal Granite Department, though that would be convenient. But it should leave patterns that cannot be explained more simply by known techniques. That is where the debate becomes interesting, because the stone may preserve evidence, but evidence still has to be read carefully. Then there is the matter of abrasives. Corundum is a very hard mineral, ranking just below diamond on the Mohs scale. Emery is a natural abrasive rock rich in corundum along with other minerals. If ancient craftspeople used corundum-rich abrasives, then some cutting and drilling problems become less mysterious. A bronze or copper tool with a hard abrasive slurry can work stone far more effectively than metal alone. This does not make the work easy. It makes it possible. It also reminds us that the phrase copper tools can be misleading if it makes people imagine someone trying to carve granite with a soft metal knife while hoping for the best. The real toolkit may have included abrasives, pressure, water, tubular drills, saws, pounders, grinding stones, polishing compounds, and above all human skill passed down over generations. Still, even that may not answer every detail people point to at the Serapeum. Large stone boxes with polished surfaces and massive lids require not only cutting ability but measurement. You need flatness, squareness, alignment, and an understanding of how tiny errors become large problems when the object is enormous. Precision is often treated as if it belongs only to modern industry, but ancient people could achieve remarkable precision when they had motivation, practice, and measuring methods suited to the task. A straight edge, plumb line, square, chord, level surface, and repeated checking can do more than we sometimes assume. If you have ever watched a patient craftsperson make something by hand, you know the difference between simple tools and simple results. The tools may be modest, the hands are not. The inscription claim adds another layer of intrigue. Some versions of the story describe an untranslatable or difficult inscription that supposedly refers to an unknown power source. This is the sort of claim that needs very careful handling. Ancient Egyptian writing is complex, full of religious language, titles, offerings, names, ritual phrases, damaged signs, reused surfaces, and changes over time. A phrase that seems mysterious in translation may be poetic, symbolic, broken, or simply not fully understood in context. It might refer to divine power rather than mechanical power. It might describe ritual energy, sacred force, or the presence of a god. Or it might be a later scratch, a poor inscription, a damaged name, or something much less spectacular than it sounds when pulled out of context. But that does not mean inscriptions are unimportant. Quite the opposite. Writing can anchor a monument to a person, a date, a ritual, or a king. At the Serapeum, inscriptions and stelae helped scholars build parts of Egyptian chronology because they recorded the lives and deaths of Apis bulls and the reigns under which they were buried. The written evidence is one of the reasons we know the site was not just a strange underground warehouse for granite boxes. It was part of a long religious tradition. If an inscription is claimed to describe a lost technology, we need to ask who read it, where it is located, what the signs actually are, whether Egyptologists agree on the reading, and whether the translation has been stretched beyond what the words can bear. Ancient texts can be mysterious without secretly being instruction manuals for a machine. This is where the story becomes less about choosing a side and more about learning how to look. The Serapeum does not need exaggerated claims to be astonishing. Even under the mainstream view, it represents an extraordinary achievement of quarrying, transport, religious organisation, stoneworking, and long-term planning. If the ancient Egyptians made these boxes with known tools and hard abrasives, that is not disappointing. It is remarkable. It means human patience and craft can produce results that still make modern visitors doubt their eyes. If, however, future measurements and analysis were to show that some marks cannot be explained by the accepted methods, then the answer would not automatically be aliens, electricity, or a forgotten power plant. It would mean we had more to learn about ancient engineering. That would be exciting enough. So as we begin, let us keep the stone in front of us and the claims at a respectful distance. Let us imagine the corridor, the air cooler than the desert above, the ceiling low in places, the walls rougher than the polished surfaces waiting in the chambers. Somewhere ahead sits a dark granite box with a lid heavier than most houses' contents. It was made for a sacred animal, placed in a tomb, broken open by later hands, studied by archaeologists, filmed by travellers, argued over by engineers, and turned into a modern mystery by people who cannot quite believe what they're seeing. Whether it proves lost technology or simply lost patience, it deserves a closer look. And the first thing to understand is the place itself, because before we can ask how the boxes were made, we need to understand why anyone went to such enormous effort to place them beneath Saqqara in the first place. To find the Serapeum, we have to begin above ground, under the wide light of Saqqara, where the desert does something rather clever. It makes everything look empty until you realise it is absolutely full. A quiet patch of sand may hide a shaft. A low ridge may be the edge of a buried wall. A scatter of stones may mark the place where people once carried offerings, whispered prayers, counted days, and tried to keep order between the living and the dead. Saqqara is not one monument, but a whole landscape of monuments, built and reused across many centuries. It is one of those places where ancient Egypt does not appear as a single moment frozen in time, but as a long conversation with itself. Kings, priests, workers, animals, gods, officials, pilgrims, robbers, explorers, and archaeologists all pass through in different ages, each leaving something behind, even if that something was only a footprint that the wind later erased with great efficiency. The Serapeum lies within this larger world, close to Memphis, the old capital where the god Ptah was especially important. Memphis was a city of craftsmen, priests, administrators, temples, workshops, and political power, and Ptah was understood as a creator god, a divine maker, a force associated with skill, form, and sacred design. That matters because the animal buried at the Serapeum was not just an animal in the ordinary sense. The Apis bull was treated as a living expression of divine presence. Priests selected a bull according to particular markings and signs, and once chosen, that animal lived with privilege and ritual attention. It was fed, watched, honoured, and understood as something more than livestock. To modern ears, that may sound strange, though perhaps no stranger than people today giving their pets more comfortable beds than their guests, or apologising to a cat for moving it from a chair it does not own, but somehow definitely owns. When an Apis bull died, the death was not treated casually. It involved mourning, ceremony, embalming, procession, and burial. Over time, the Serapeum became the place where these sacred bulls were placed after death, hidden below the desert in underground galleries. This was not a quick little burial dug at the edge of a field. It was a sacred installation, extended, maintained, and returned to across a long stretch of Egyptian history. The official explanation is that the Serapeum was a tomb for the mummified remains of the Apis bulls, associated with Ptah and Memphis, and used from the New Kingdom down into the Ptolemaic period. That gives the site a long life, and with long life comes change. Tunnels were extended, chambers were added, kings made offerings, priests left inscriptions. The dead bulls became part of an ongoing religious record, almost like entries in a sacred archive, except the archive was carved into bedrock and guarded by stone boxes large enough to make any filing cabinet feel inadequate. Approaching the Serapeum in the ancient world would not have been the same as simply buying a ticket and following a modern path with sensible shoes and a bottle of water. There was once an avenue of sphinxes leading toward it, a ceremonial approach that turned the journey itself into something deliberate. A sphinx avenue is not just decoration. It tells the visitor that they are entering a controlled sacred zone, a place where the ordinary world is being left behind in stages. You do not stumble into a landscape like this by accident, unless you are a very determined goat. The ancient visitor would have seen markers of power and devotion, before ever reaching the underground passages. The approach helped prepare the mind. Above ground, sunlight, statues, temples, and open air. Below ground, corridors, chambers, darkness, stone, and the quiet presence of the dead. The modern rediscovery of the Serapeum belongs to the 19th century, a period when Egyptology was still becoming a formal discipline, and when European explorers moved through Egypt with a mixture of curiosity, ambition, scholarship, and habits that would make modern archaeologists wince into their notebooks. Auguste Mariette, the French Egyptologist, is the name usually attached to the rediscovery. In the early 1850s, he followed clues in the sands of Saqqara, including traces connected to the Sphinx Avenue, and entered the underground chambers. It is easy to imagine that moment too dramatically, with a lamp raised high, a gust of ancient air, and perhaps a violin section appearing from nowhere. Reality was probably dustier, harder, and involved more digging. But even stripped of drama, it must have been extraordinary. Beneath the sand was not a single tomb but a system of passages, and inside those passages were the huge sarcophagi of the sacred bulls, along with inscriptions and objects that helped scholars reconstruct pieces of ancient Egyptian chronology. Mariette's work revealed that the Serapeum was not simply an isolated curiosity. It was connected with many reigns, many burials, and many historical names. Inscriptions recorded royal offerings and sacred events. Among the important figures associated with the site was Khemwaset, a son of Rameses II and High Priest of Ptah, often remembered as one of ancient Egypt's great restorers and preservers of monuments. He appears almost like an early antiquarian inside ancient Egypt itself, a man interested in older sacred places and the careful maintenance of memory. That gives the Serapeum an unusual double depth. To us, it is ancient. But even to some ancient Egyptians, parts of Saqqara were already old. They were not only building history. They were looking back at history, repairing it, honouring it, and sometimes adding new layers to it. Saqqara was not a museum exactly, but it had a museum-like quality in the sense that the past was always present, sometimes inconveniently underfoot. Once inside the Serapeum, the atmosphere changes in the imagination. Above ground, Egypt often feels open and enormous. The desert sky is wide. The sun gives everything a sharp edge. But underground, scale behaves differently. A corridor may be long, but the ceiling presses closer. Shadows hide measurements from the eye. Sound becomes smaller and stranger. A footstep is not just a footstep, but a soft report from the stone around you. The walls are cut from the earth itself. The chambers open to the side. And there, occupying those chambers, are the granite giants that have made the site famous far beyond ordinary discussions of ancient animal cults. The boxes are not elegant in the way a painted tomb is elegant. They are not delicate. They do not charm you first, they impose themselves. They sit with the kind of presence that makes people instinctively lower their voices, as if a block of stone might be sleeping and should not be disturbed before breakfast. These sarcophagi were made to hold the remains of sacred bulls, but they also hold a modern argument. Their size and material have turned them into a meeting point for archaeology, engineering, speculation, and wonder. Many visitors and researchers are struck first by the scale. A human body beside one of these containers looks small. A single worker with a hand tool looks almost comic in comparison, like someone arriving to mow a field with nail scissors. Some boxes are commonly described in popular discussions as weighing many dozens of tons, and with lids included, the numbers become even more intimidating. Exact weights can vary depending on the stone and the specific sarcophagus being discussed, but the broad point remains clear. These were not minor objects. They required a planned chain of work from quarry to burial chamber, and each step in that chain involved skill, labour, and risk. The stone itself deepens the problem. Granite is hard because it is made of tough minerals locked together in a crystalline structure. It is not impossible to work, but it does not politely cooperate. It resists, it chips, it wears down tools, It requires abrasion rather than simple cutting in the way we might cut wood. For ancient Egyptian craftsmen, shaping granite meant using methods that could slowly remove material, smooth surfaces, and correct mistakes before they became permanent. This is where the question of tools begins to appear. But before we rush into copper saws, sand, corundum, drilling marks, or claims of lost machines, it helps to sit for a while with the setting. The Serapeum was not a workshop display. It was a sacred underground burial complex. Whatever methods were used to make the boxes, their final destination was not a factory floor, but a ritual landscape beneath Saqqara. That context matters because the Egyptians often invested enormous effort in things that were religiously important. A modern person may ask why anyone would spend so much energy making a huge stone sarcophagus for a bull, but that question tells us more about modern priorities than ancient ones. If the Apis bull represented divine presence, then its burial was not a practical disposal problem, it was a sacred duty. The container had to express permanence, honour, and protection. Hard stone was not chosen because it was convenient. It was chosen because it lasted. Granite does not rot. It does not burn easily. It does not crumble in the hand. It gives the impression of resisting time itself, which is exactly the sort of quality a culture obsessed with afterlife, order, and eternal continuity might appreciate. In ancient Egypt, materials were not neutral. Gold, lapis, limestone, basalt, granite, wood, linen, resin, and pigments all carried associations. A stone box could be both an object and a statement. Yet the moment we accept the religious explanation, the mechanical questions do not disappear. They become sharper. It is one thing to say why the boxes were made. It is another to explain how. A sacred purpose can motivate great labour, but it cannot by itself hollow granite. Devotion does not automatically produce a flat surface. Ritual does not lift a heavy lid into place, unless one has a very generous definition of ritual and a very nervous team of workers with ropes. The Serapeum therefore sits at the crossing of belief and engineering. It shows us a society where religious obligation could mobilise technical skill at a high level. This is one reason the site is so fascinating. The boxes are not mysterious only because they are big. They are mysterious because they force two kinds of knowledge to stand together. The symbolic world of the Apis bull and the practical world of stone, measurement, transport, and labour. The underground layout itself adds to the feeling of difficulty. These sarcophagi were not simply placed in an open yard. They were brought into chambers reached by corridors cut into rock. Moving heavy objects is always easier when space is open and the ground can be prepared freely. Underground, every turn matters. Every slope matters. Every uneven surface becomes an argument between gravity and human planning. If a box shifts the wrong way, you cannot simply call for a modern crane and a team in bright helmets. You have ropes, levers, sledges, wooden supports, muscle, calculation, and patience. And patience, though powerful, has never been known to fill out a safety report. The workers had to understand friction, balance, load distribution, and the behaviour of stone, even if they did not describe those things in modern engineering language. Practical knowledge does not need equations to be real. It can live in hands, eyes, habits, and repeated experience. One of the most important things to remember is that ancient Egypt had a long tradition of moving large stone. Obelisks, statues, columns, blocks, and sarcophagi were transported across distances that still impress us. There are depictions of large statues being dragged on sledges, with workers pulling ropes and liquid poured ahead of the sledge to reduce friction. Boats carried heavy loads along the Nile. Quarries supplied stone to building sites through organised labour systems. None of this means the Serapeum boxes were easy. It means they belong to a culture with established methods for doing difficult things in stone. That point often gets lost in modern arguments. We sometimes swing between two extremes. Either ancient people were helpless with simple tools, or every difficult object must imply a forgotten high technology. The more interesting truth is that ancient societies could be extremely capable without being modern. Their technology could be simple in appearance and sophisticated in use. Still, standing in imagination before one of the Serapeum boxes, it's easy to understand why some people feel dissatisfied with ordinary explanations. The dark stone surfaces, the large lids, the sense of underground precision, the way the boxes seem too severe and too controlled for something made by hand, all of it encourages suspicion. The eye looks for machine logic. We live in a world where smoothness and straightness usually come from factories. When we see a hard stone surface that looks clean and regular, our instincts reach for diamond tools, power saws, milling machines, cranes, and laser levels. But that instinct can mislead us. A hand-polished surface can look astonishingly modern. A patiently ground plane can feel machine-made. Human labour, when multiplied over time and guided by skilled supervision, can leave behind objects that embarrass our assumptions. At the same time, there is nothing wrong with asking for evidence. If someone says these boxes show extraordinary accuracy, the next question should be, how was that measured? With what instruments? Across which surfaces? Compared to what standard? Was the stone weathered, repaired, unfinished, or damaged? Were the interiors measured in multiple places or judged visually? Precision is a real subject, not a feeling. A box may look perfect in a photograph and be much less perfect under detailed survey. Or it may turn out to be genuinely impressive in ways that deserve more attention. Either result is useful. The trouble begins when awe is treated as proof, or when skepticism is treated as an insult. The stone does not care which side wins an internet argument. It only preserves marks, surfaces, fractures, and traces of work. The task is to read them properly. The Serapeum's fame today owes a lot to the way those stone boxes have been photographed, filmed, and discussed by people outside traditional archaeology. In dim light, with a camera moving slowly past a polished granite wall, the site feels less like a tomb and more like a vault from some forgotten industrial age. The boxes are often described as too large, too accurate, or too difficult for the tools usually associated with ancient Egypt. This is where the idea of lost technology enters, not always as a wild claim at first, but as a question. Were the Egyptians using a technique we have not fully reconstructed? Did they have access to abrasives or tool designs that are underappreciated? Did later scholars underestimate the quality of ancient stoneworking? Or, as some more dramatic voices suggest, are we looking at evidence of a machine process whose supporting technology vanished completely? Those questions are not all the same. Some are reasonable historical questions, some are engineering questions, some are speculative leaps wearing a very exciting hat. A lost craft technique is not the same as an advanced energy device. A misunderstood abrasive method is not the same as ultrasonic machining. A difficult inscription is not automatically a technical manual. The Serapeum becomes clearer when we separate the scale of claims. Ancient Egyptians may have done things with stone that we do not yet fully understand in practical detail, and that alone is worth exploring. But moving from we do not know every step to therefore they had modern-like machinery is like finding flour on a kitchen counter and concluding that a ghost baked a cake. Possible in a story perhaps, but not the first explanation to test. What makes the Serapeum so useful for this discussion is that it gives us a concentrated physical problem. The objects are there, the chambers are there, the historical context is there, the religious purpose is reasonably clear. The disputed part is the making. That allows us to ask grounded questions. Where did the stone come from? How was it quarried? What tool marks remain? Were the boxes finished before transport or after placement? How were the lids fitted? Were all the sarcophagi made to the same standard, or do they vary? Are some surfaces rougher than popular images suggest? Do damaged areas reveal stages of work? Are there traces of abrasive residues? Can experimental archaeology reproduce similar marks using known materials? These questions do not drain the mystery away. They give it something better than fog. They give it edges. The Serapeum also reminds us that archaeological sites are rarely as tidy as the stories told about them. It was used for a long time. It was entered, altered, robbed, damaged, studied, and restored. Some burials were disturbed in antiquity. Some chambers were opened by explorers. Some objects were removed. Some records from early excavation are incomplete by modern standards. The site we imagine as a sealed ancient mystery is actually a place with a complicated afterlife. That does not make it less important. It makes it more difficult to interpret. When someone points to an empty sarcophagus and says no bull was ever there, we have to remember looting, disturbance, decay, and early excavation practices. When someone points to a broken lid and says it proves desperate entry into a sealed technological container, we have to ask who broke it, when, and why. Ancient tombs are not crime scenes preserved 5 minutes after the event. They are more like rooms that have been visited by centuries of people with different motives and very little concern for making things easy for us. Inside that complicated history, the granite giants remain the central presence. They are too large to ignore and too silent to settle the argument. They invite admiration before explanation. Even the most conventional view leaves us with a serious achievement. Hard stone, quarried, shaped, transported, installed underground, and used in a long-running sacred cult. The Serapeum does not need to be a power station or a machine hall to be astonishing. It already is astonishing as a burial place. But because the objects are so physically demanding, they naturally lead us toward the next layer of the story, where the calm darkness of the corridors gives way to a closer look at mass, measurement, material, and the stubborn fact that a stone box weighing many tons does not become hollow, simply because someone has a ceremony planned for Tuesday. A massive stone sarcophagus is a strange kind of object to stand beside, even in the imagination. It does not behave like a statue, because a statue usually tells you what it wants to be. A king, a god, a guardian, a kneeling official holding an offering. It does not behave like a wall, because a wall belongs to a building and makes sense as part of a structure. It is not quite a tomb by itself either, because it is too deliberate, too engineered, too much like a container designed for something specific and important. The great stone boxes of the Serapeum sit in that uncomfortable middle place. They are not decorative, they are not delicate, they are not easy to move, easy to carve, or easy to explain in a single sentence. They are simply there, large, dark, heavy, and silent, as if waiting for every visitor to ask the same question and then refusing to answer out loud. When people speak of the Serapeum's stone boxes, the number that often appears is 100 tons. It is a dramatic number, and like many dramatic numbers in ancient history, it needs to be handled with care. Some individual sarcophagi are more commonly described as weighing many dozens of tons, and their separate lids can add many more tons on top of that. Depending on which box is being discussed, what stone was used, and whether someone is counting the body and lid together, popular estimates can climb toward the famous 100-ton figure. But whether the true weight of a particular example is 40 tons, 60 tons, 70 tons or more with its lid, the basic reality does not become much easier. At a certain point, the human mind stops treating the number as a number and starts treating it as weather. Very heavy is very heavy. A little more very heavy does not help the person holding the rope. The size is only the beginning. These were not rough boulders dragged into a hole and left there. They were shaped into large rectangular containers, hollowed out, finished, and fitted with lids. The very word box makes them sound almost familiar, as if we're talking about something that might hold blankets in a hallway cupboard. But these were boxes in the way a whale is technically an animal. True, but not quite enough information. The bodies of the sarcophagi had thick walls, deep interiors, and surfaces that in many cases were carefully worked. They were made from hard stone, including granite, basalt, and other dense materials, the kind that do not forgive clumsy tools or careless planning. A worker cannot simply change his mind halfway through a granite sarcophagus. and decide it would make a nice bird bath instead. Every stage of the process commits the maker more deeply to the final result. Try for a moment to imagine the first decision. Somewhere, perhaps at a quarry far from Saqqara, a suitable mass of stone had to be chosen. Not just any stone would do. It had to be large enough, sound enough, and free enough of flaws that it could survive the journey from rough block to sacred container. A crack hidden inside the stone could ruin months or years of work. Too small, and it could not hold the burial. Too fractured, and it might fail under its own weight. Too irregular, and extra labour would be needed to bring it into shape. Ancient quarrymen understood stone not as an abstract material, but as a difficult partner. They knew how it split, how it rang, how it resisted, how it betrayed weakness, and how it behaved when struck again and again. This was not guesswork done by people wandering about with hopeful expressions. It was skilled work built on long familiarity. Once a block was quarried, the problems multiplied. A sarcophagus is not merely an outside shape, it has an inside. That means material had to be removed from the heart of the stone, not just trimmed from its edges. Hollowing hard stone is slow work because every bit of interior volume has to go somewhere. One can shape the exterior by pounding, chipping, sawing, grinding and polishing from the outside inward, but the interior requires working down into a confined space. The deeper the hollow becomes, the more awkward the work. Tools must reach into corners, abrasives must be cleared, dust and slurry must be removed, measurements must be checked. If the walls are made too thin, the stone may crack. If they are too thick, the object becomes heavier than necessary, although at this scale, heavier than necessary is rather like saying the ocean is a little damp. The interiors are part of what makes the Serapeum so fascinating to modern observers. Some visitors describe them as remarkably smooth and regular. Others note that not every surface is finished to the same level, and that damage, lighting, dust, and expectation can change what the eye believes it is seeing. This matters because the boxes have become famous in part through photographs and videos that emphasize their most impressive surfaces. In a dim underground chamber, a polished stone wall can look almost impossibly precise. Shine a light along it, and the surface may seem to stretch away like something produced in a modern workshop. But the proper question is not whether it looks impressive. Of course it does. The proper question is what close measurement shows, what tool marks remain, and whether those marks fit better with known stoneworking methods or something more unusual. The silence of these objects encourages large claims. They do not come with a workshop manual. There is no surviving Egyptian diagram showing the exact sequence of cutting, hollowing, grinding, moving, lowering and fitting one of these boxes into its final chamber. We have related evidence for ancient stoneworking elsewhere in Egypt, including unfinished objects, quarry marks, drill holes, saw marks, tool fragments, abrasive use, and depictions of transport. But for the Serapeum sarcophagi specifically, much of the making process has to be reconstructed from physical traces and from what is known about Egyptian technology more generally. That gap between object and process is where mystery grows. Sometimes it grows carefully, like a question. Sometimes it grows wildly, like a houseplant that has discovered the window and now thinks it owns the room. One of the claims often attached to the Serapeum is that the boxes are too precise to have been made by hand. This claim sounds simple, but it hides several different questions. What does too precise mean? Too flat? Too square? Too smooth? Too symmetrical? Too hard to polish? Too difficult to move? A surface can be very smooth without being perfectly flat. A corner can look sharp without being mathematically exact. An object can be impressive without being impossible. Ancient craft often sits exactly in that space. It can exceed casual expectations while still being made by human hands using tools that seem modest to us. Think of a violin, a sword, a wooden ship, a cathedral window, or a hand-ground lens. None of these require modern machinery to be remarkable. They require patience, knowledge, repetition, and a culture that values the result enough to train people properly. Yet it is also fair to say that some ancient Egyptian stonework deserves more respect than a shrug. Saying they used copper tools and sand can become too simple if it is used as a magic phrase instead of an explanation. Copper by itself is not suited to cutting granite in the way a steel saw cuts wood. The cutting action depends on abrasive grains, water, pressure and movement. If the abrasive is hard enough, it does the real work while the softer tool guides it. That principle is sound, but it still leaves practical questions. How were the tools shaped? How was pressure maintained? How was straightness controlled? How were large surfaces checked? How long did each stage take? How many workers were needed? Were different abrasive materials used for different stages? These are not questions asked only by alternative researchers. They are the practical questions any careful reconstruction should face. The lids add another layer of difficulty. A sarcophagus body without a lid would already be a major achievement. A lid means a second huge stone piece had to be made to match the first. It had to be transported and placed. It had to sit securely. In some cases, lids were broken by ancient robbers or later intruders, leaving fragments that show both the thickness of the stone and the violence needed to enter. Imagine the moment of placing such a lid. Even if it was done with levers, sledges, rollers, ramps, sand, or some combination of methods, the operation required control. Too much force in the wrong direction, and the lid could chip, jam, slide, or crush something important. Perhaps a wooden support, perhaps a worker's foot, perhaps the confidence of everyone nearby. Moving heavy stone is not just about strength. It is about keeping strength disciplined. Transport into the underground galleries may be the most quietly difficult part of the entire puzzle. If the sarcophagi were finished outside and then moved in, they had to pass through the corridors and be manoeuvred into side chambers. If they were partly finished in place, then large rough blocks still had to be brought underground, and finishing had to occur in confined spaces. Either scenario is difficult. Some explanations suggest that chambers could be filled with sand to help lower sarcophagi into place gradually, using the controlled removal of sand as a kind of ancient lowering mechanism. This is a clever idea because sand can support weight and then be released bit by bit. It is not glamorous, which may be why it receives less attention than theories involving vanished machines, but it has the advantage of using materials Egyptians had in generous supply. If Egypt ever ran short of sand, one suspects there would have been larger problems than sarcophagus installation. The presence of these heavy boxes underground also raises a question about sequence. Were the galleries cut first, with chambers prepared to receive finished sarcophagi? Were some chambers enlarged around objects already in place? Were ramps or temporary passageways used and then removed or altered? Ancient building and burial projects often involve temporary features that do not survive clearly. Workers may build ramps that are later dismantled, fill spaces that are later cleared, or use wooden equipment that decays entirely. The absence of a complete lifting machine or transport frame does not prove it never existed. Wood, rope, leather and fibre rarely survive the way stone survives. A stone box can sit for thousands of years and keep its secrets. A rope can do the hard work and then vanish without even leaving a polite note. This is one reason heavy ancient objects can seem more mysterious than they were to the people who moved them. We see the permanent result but not the temporary systems. We see the block but not the scaffolding. We see the chamber but not the ramp. We see the polished surface but not the workers covered in grit, water, sweat, and perhaps a certain amount of ancient complaining. The ancient Egyptians did not need to leave every tool in place for the benefit of future documentaries. They were trying to complete a sacred project, not prepare evidence for an argument in the 21st century. Still, the fact that temporary systems vanished does not give us permission to invent any system we like. It simply reminds us that the missing parts of the process must be inferred carefully. The greatest temptation with the Serapeum boxes is to let their scale do all the thinking for us. Large things feel impossible because our bodies are small. A human standing beside a granite sarcophagus feels the difference between muscle and mass immediately. But ancient engineering often solves such differences by breaking one impossible task into many possible ones. You do not lift a huge object by deciding to be stronger. You reduce friction. You spread weight. You use levers. You prepare the ground. You coordinate teams. You move slowly. You accept that speed is not the point. The modern mind, trained by engines and deadlines, often underestimates the power of slow, organised labour. We ask how long it would take because time feels expensive to us. Ancient states, especially those with religious and royal authority, could spend labour differently. Not casually, not infinitely, but in ways that do not match modern workplace calendars. A sacred bull burial was not squeezed in between meetings. Still, there remains an emotional difference between saying a thing could be done and showing exactly how it was done. This is where the Serapeum keeps its power. The mainstream view can provide broad methods: quarrying, abrasive cutting, grinding, polishing, transport by river and land, lowering by ramps or sand, and skilled labour. But the specific reconstruction of each sarcophagus, from quarry face to chamber floor, is harder to describe in detail. That does not make advanced lost technology the automatic answer. It makes the site a challenge. The stone asks for experiment. It asks for measurement. It asks for humility from both sides. The person who says obviously impossible may be underestimating ancient craft. The person who says obviously easy may be underestimating granite. Granite has a way of correcting overconfidence, usually by remaining granite. Some alternative writers point to the fact that many of the Serapeum boxes are uninscribed, or that their size seems excessive for animal burials, and suggest they may have served another purpose before being reused. This idea is intriguing but not easy to prove. Reuse was common in ancient Egypt. Objects, stones, monuments, and spaces could be repurposed over centuries. But an object being uninscribed does not automatically mean it was not made for the purpose in which it was found. Many practical or sacred objects are plain. A lack of inscription may reflect period, budget, ritual preference, damage, unfinished work, or simply choice. The empty state of many sarcophagi today also has to be viewed through the long history of tomb robbery and excavation. Absence can be meaningful, but it can also be the result of people breaking in and taking things long before modern visitors arrived to wonder why nothing was there. There's a subtler mystery in the boxes that does not require dramatic claims at all. Why this form? Why such thick walls? Why such hard stone? Why such a long underground arrangement for sacred bulls? The answer probably lies in a combination of theology, status, tradition, and permanence. The Apis bull was not a symbolic afterthought. It was part of a major cult connected with Memphis and Ptah, and over time its burial became an event of political and religious importance. Kings could associate themselves with the cult. Priests could preserve records. Offerings could be made. The sarcophagus was not merely a container for remains. It was a monument to continuity. In Egyptian thought, preserving the body and securing the burial mattered deeply. A massive hard stone box declared that the sacred presence of the bull had been treated with seriousness. It transformed the burial from disposal into architecture, and yet the boxes do not feel fully explained by meaning alone, because meaning does not leave tool marks. Meaning does not tell us how the interior corners were finished, how the lid was seated, or how the surface was brought to its final smoothness. The physical object insists on physical questions. When a visitor sees the long, flat side of a sarcophagus, the mind begins to imagine saws. When the visitor sees the hollow interior, the mind imagines drills, chisels, pounders, abrasives, and workers taking turns. When the visitor hears claims of ultrasonic cutting, the mind imagines vibrating tools and slurry humming against the stone. When the visitor hears a conventional explanation, the mind imagines copper, sand, water, and a great deal of time. The stone becomes a screen onto which different processes are projected. The real evidence lies in the surfaces themselves, but those surfaces have to be studied more carefully than wonder alone allows. One useful way to think about the sarcophagi is to separate the problem into stages. First, the raw block, then the rough exterior shaping, then the hollowing, then the refinement of interior and exterior planes, then the lid, then transport, then installation, then sealing, then later breakage, robbery, rediscovery, and modern interpretation. Each stage may have used different techniques. The rough work could involve pounding with harder stone tools to remove large amounts of material. Sawing with abrasive slurry could help create cuts. Drilling could remove material or define corners. Grinding could flatten and smooth surfaces. Polishing could produce the final finish. Measuring tools could guide the geometry. None of these steps is magical by itself. Together, at huge scale and in hard stone, they become formidable. That is the real source of awe. Not one impossible act, but thousands upon thousands of difficult acts completed in sequence without losing the thread. The thought of the original workers is often missing from modern debates. We discuss tools, weights and theories, but less often the people who knew how to do this work. Stonecutters do not appear as anonymous muscle in the real world. They are specialists. They learn by doing. They develop judgment that is hard to write down. They notice changes in sound when a tool strikes stone. They know how much pressure is too much. They know when a surface is ready for the next stage. They know which abrasive cuts well and which merely makes mud with ambition. If the Serapeum boxes were made by known ancient methods, then they are not evidence against ancient Egyptians. They are evidence for them. They show the existence of organised skill at a level that modern viewers may not immediately understand, because modern viewers are not, on the whole, spending their evenings hollowing granite by lamplight. At the same time, it is reasonable to ask whether some methods remain poorly documented. Ancient technology is not limited to what survives in museum cases. A tool made of wood may disappear. A technique may be passed through apprenticeship and never written down. A special abrasive source may be used and later forgotten. A method of supporting, rotating, or guiding tools may leave only indirect traces. Lost technology does not have to mean electric motors or hidden power plants. It can mean lost craft knowledge. It can mean practical procedures no one uses anymore because the social and economic world that supported them disappeared. In that sense, there almost certainly is lost technology at the Serapeum, not necessarily in the dramatic sense, but in the ordinary historical sense that many human skills vanish when the people who practice them are gone. This is why the phrase 100 tons of silence works so well for the Serapeum boxes. The silence is not only the silence of stone, it is the silence of missing process. The boxes do not tell us how many workers stood around them. They do not tell us whether someone supervised measurements with a cord and square. They do not tell us how often a tool broke, how long a surface took to finish, how much abrasive was used, or what the workers thought when the final lid was moved into place. They do not tell us whether the process felt ordinary to trained craftsmen, or extraordinary even then. They simply remain, and modern people, uncomfortable with silence, fill it with explanations. Some explanations are careful, some are dramatic, some are useful. Some are just granite-shaped daydreams wearing a hard hat. The best approach is to let the silence remain a little while longer without rushing to decorate it. These sarcophagi are heavy, difficult, and impressive. They do not prove by their existence alone a lost advanced machine. They also should not be reduced to a casual footnote, as if hard stone simply becomes a sacred box when enough workers are available and everyone has had breakfast. They occupy the important middle ground where ancient skill is both real and still partly mysterious. That is a more interesting place than either certainty or dismissal. It allows us to admire the Egyptians without turning them into modern engineers in linen, and to question the evidence without assuming every unanswered question hides a generator. As we look more closely, the next clues are not only in the size of the boxes but in the marks left on stone. A mass can impress us, but a mark can speak more specifically. A groove, a drill line, a polished plane, a rough patch, a corner left unfinished, a saw cut preserved in another monument nearby or far away. These are the traces that can move the discussion from awe into investigation. If the Serapeum sarcophagi were made by patient abrasion and known tools, the stone should remember that in one way. If they were shaped by a more unusual process, the stone should remember that too. Granite forgets many things, but it does not forget everything, and the next question is whether its surfaces carry the ordinary scars of ancient craft, or the stranger signature of a method we have not yet fully understood. If the Serapeum stone boxes feel at first like a challenge thrown across thousands of years, then the mainstream archaeological answer begins in a much quieter place. Not with vanished engines, not with humming devices hidden beneath temple floors, and not with an ancient foreman casually switching on a machine before lunch, but with stone, copper, sand, water, rope, wood, pounding tools, measuring lines, trained hands, and a great deal of organised patience. That may sound almost disappointing after standing beside a granite giant in a dark corridor. It is rather like being shown a locked iron door, and then told the key is in the kitchen drawer. But ancient technology often works that way. It does not always look impressive in pieces. Its power appears when simple parts are combined by people who know exactly what they're doing. The first thing to clear away is the phrase copper tools, because it can create the wrong image in the mind. When people hear that ancient Egyptians used copper to work hard stone, they sometimes imagine a worker trying to carve granite with something like a soft butter knife. Then they look at the Serapeum boxes and understandably think no, absolutely not, unless that butter knife had a secret university degree in engineering. But the copper was often not expected to be the hard cutting edge in the modern sense. In many hard stone operations, the real cutting came from abrasive particles, especially quartz sand and possibly other harder minerals in certain contexts. The copper tool guided the abrasive. The abrasive wore away the stone. The water helped carry the grit, dust and slurry. The worker supplied motion, pressure, judgment, and the kind of persistence most of us lose after assembling one flat-pack bookshelf. This is a crucial point. A soft tool can cut a hard material if it carries harder abrasive grains between itself and the surface. Modern lapidary work still uses this principle in different forms. The tool does not always need to be harder than the stone if the abrasive does the removing. Imagine cleaning a pan with a soft cloth and gritty powder. The cloth itself is not harder than the pan, but it holds and moves the abrasive. Now make the pan granite, the cloth copper, the powder quartz sand, and the afternoon much, much longer. That, in simplified form, is the kind of process mainstream Egyptology often points to when explaining how hard stone could be cut, drilled, and shaped with materials available in the ancient Nile Valley. Before any cutting began, though, the stone had to come from somewhere. Egypt's great stone projects depended on quarries, and quarrying is its own world of skill. Hard stones such as granite were often taken from places like Aswan, far to the south, where ancient quarry marks still show the scale of Egyptian ambition. Quarrying stone is not the same as picking up a useful rock from the ground. A block had to be isolated from the bedrock. Workers had to exploit cracks, natural weaknesses, and the behaviour of the stone under repeated impact. Dolerite pounders, made from extremely hard stone, were used to batter and bruise granite surfaces. This sounds crude until you consider that pounding is a very sensible way to attack a stone that laughs quietly at softer metal edges. Strike by strike, the surface breaks down. The work is slow, loud, dusty, and exhausting, but it is not mysterious in principle. Granite can be shaped by harder stone if the workers are willing to do what granite demands, which is mostly suffer patiently until it changes shape. Dolerite pounders are especially important because they remind us that ancient Egyptian stoneworking was not simply metal tools versus hard stone. Stone tools themselves remained part of the toolkit. A hard stone ball or pounder can remove material from granite by impact. It will not produce the final polish of a Serapeum sarcophagus, but it can rough out forms, reduce surfaces, and prepare the object for more controlled finishing. In a quarry, where beauty is not yet the main concern, this kind of method makes sense. The early work is about removing bulk. Refinement comes later. A modern viewer may see the finished object and imagine that every stage required fine cutting, but ancient makers likely moved from rough to fine, from force to control, from pounding to abrasion, from coarse grinding to polish. Once a rough block existed, shaping the outside of a sarcophagus would have required repeated correction. The sides had to be brought into straight planes, the overall proportions had to be established, the top edge had to be prepared for the lid, the surfaces had to be made regular enough to satisfy both practical and ritual expectations. This is where saws enter the discussion. Ancient Egyptian saws are known from the archaeological record and from images, and copper alloy saws were used in different contexts. For stone, a long copper blade with abrasive sand could cut by dragging hard particles across the stone surface. The metal blade would wear too, of course, and that is part of the cost of the process. The tool is not a magical cutter, it is a carrier for grit and motion. The groove slowly deepens as abrasive grains scratch and crush tiny bits of stone away. This kind of sawing would not be fast. It would also not be graceful. The workers would need to keep the cut supplied with abrasive and water, maintain alignment, remove waste, and control the motion so the saw did not wander too badly. The blade might be pulled back and forth by teams depending on size. A straight cut through hard stone could require a great deal of time, and the tool itself might need frequent repair or replacement. But slow is not the same as impossible. Ancient monumental work often depended on long repetition. Our impatience is not evidence. It is just our impatience wearing a measuring tape. Drilling is another part of the mainstream explanation, especially because hard stone drilling evidence is known from ancient Egypt. Tubular drilling is one of the most discussed techniques. In this method, a hollow copper tube turned with a bow drill or another rotating setup works with abrasive slurry to grind a circular groove into the stone. As the groove deepens, a central core remains inside the tube. Eventually, the core can be snapped or removed. This method is important because it explains why some ancient drill holes and cores look so strikingly mechanical. A circular hole in granite can seem modern if we forget that rotation, grit, and pressure are not modern inventions. People have been making things spin for a very long time. The wheel may get all the attention, but the rotating drill has been quietly doing useful work like the responsible sibling at a family gathering. Experimental archaeology has helped show that copper tube drills with sand abrasives can cut granite, though not quickly. These experiments matter because they move the discussion away from pure imagination. It is one thing to say that a method might work. It is better to try it, measure it, watch the toolware, study the marks, and compare the results with ancient examples. Experiments have shown that abrasive drilling can create cores and holes in hard stone, and that different abrasives can leave different kinds of marks. This does not solve every question about every object, but it does show that the basic principle is real. The ancient method may be slow, but it has teeth, even if those teeth are little grains of sand doing their work one scratch at a time. The hollowing of a massive sarcophagus would not necessarily have been done by sawing alone. Workers may have combined several methods. They could use pounding to remove rough material, drilling to create holes that weaken or outline sections, chisels or picks where suitable, and grinding to smooth the interior. For hard stones, pounding and abrasion would be especially important. A possible sequence might involve roughing out the interior by repeated impact and drilling, removing chunks where possible, then grinding the surfaces down with abrasive stones and slurry. Corners would require special attention because tools behave differently at edges. Flat areas can be worked more easily than tight interior angles. Anyone who has ever tried to clean the corner of a baking tray knows that corners are where optimism goes to be tested. This is one reason the interior surfaces of the Serapeum boxes are so interesting. If they were made by known methods, we might expect variation. Some surfaces might be smoother than others. Some corners might show rougher finishing. Some planes might be close to flat but not perfectly so. Some tool marks may have been removed by later polishing, while others may remain in less visible areas. A sarcophagus is not simply a block of stone, it is a record of stages. The difficulty is that later damage, lighting, dust, restoration, and modern handling can complicate what we see. The best evidence comes from careful measurement and close study, not from a quick glance under dramatic lighting. Granite, like some people before morning tea, can look very different depending on the angle. Sand is the humble hero of the mainstream explanation. Ancient Egypt had no shortage of it, though not all sand is equally useful. Quartz sand is hard enough to abrade many materials, and if selected carefully, it can help cut stone effectively. The worker does not simply throw any handful of desert onto the tool and hope for the best. Grain size, hardness, freshness, and the way the abrasive breaks during work all matter. Coarse abrasive removes material faster, but leaves rougher surfaces. Finer abrasive works more slowly but can produce smoother results. Different stages of work may use different grades. A finished polish requires progression. First remove the bulk, then smooth the scars of the rough work, then smooth the scars of that smoothing, then keep going until the surface satisfies the standard required. It is not glamorous, but it is a method that can produce impressive results. Corundum and emery complicate the picture in a useful way. Corundum is much harder than quartz, and emery is a natural abrasive mixture that can contain corundum. Evidence for corundum abrasive in Egyptian contexts suggests that ancient craftspeople may have had access to and knowledge of harder abrasive materials, at least in some periods and places. This does not mean every granite surface at the Serapeum was shaped with corundum. It also does not mean there was a secret industrial supply chain hidden behind every temple wall. But it does show that the ancient abrasive toolkit may have been richer than the simple phrase sand suggests. When alternative discussions say copper could not cut granite, the mainstream response is not that copper alone cheerfully sliced through it. The response is that copper, sand, quartz, emery, corundum-rich material where available, water, pressure and time can together do work that copper alone could not. This distinction is important because many arguments about ancient stoneworking accidentally attack a simplified version of the conventional view. If someone says, copper is too soft to cut granite, they are right in the narrow sense. But mainstream researchers are usually not claiming that copper teeth bit through granite like a modern steel blade through pine. They are describing abrasive cutting and grinding. The softness of copper may even help in some cases because abrasive grains can embed into it or be carried by it. The tool wears, but the stone wears too. The process is a battle of attrition, not a clean slicing action. If modern power tools are a quick conversation, abrasive stoneworking is a long argument in which the granite slowly loses because the workers refuse to leave. Measuring was another essential part of the explanation. Ancient Egyptians had simple but effective measuring tools: cords, rods, squares, plumb lines, levels, straight edges, and sighting methods. A modern machine shop may use digital readouts and precision instruments, but the basic problems of straightness, level, squareness, and repeatability are much older. A flat plane can be checked against another surface. A line can be stretched. A corner can be compared to a square. High spots can be marked and ground down. Repetition improves accuracy. This is how handwork can achieve results that look surprisingly precise. It takes time, but it does not require electronic control. The key is not only having tools, but having standards. A culture that builds temples, aligns monuments, carves statues, and records measurements clearly had traditions of planning and checking. The Serapeum boxes in this view were products of a large organised system. They were not weekend projects by enthusiastic amateurs. Their making would have required quarry workers, transport crews, stonecutters, polishers, supervisors, priests, administrators, and probably many people whose names were never recorded because history is often rude that way. Food had to be supplied, tools had to be made and repaired, abrasive had to be gathered, selected and carried, work had to be scheduled around seasons, river transport, labour availability and ritual timing. The object we see underground is the final visible result of an invisible organisation. That organisation is technology too. Not a machine perhaps, but a system. Ancient states could mobilise resources in ways that turn individual weakness into collective strength. Moving the finished or partly finished sarcophagus required another set of methods. Heavy stone transport in Egypt often involved sledges, ropes, prepared tracks, levers, rollers in some contexts, and lubrication to reduce friction. A famous scene from the tomb of Dutiothep shows a large statue being dragged on a sledge, while a person pours liquid in front of it, commonly interpreted as a way to reduce friction or stabilise the path. The basic principle is straightforward. You do not defeat weight, you manage it. A sledge spreads the load. Wetting the ground can reduce resistance under certain conditions. Ropes allow many workers to pull together. Levers allow small movements to be controlled. Ramps allow vertical changes to be handled gradually. None of these methods is easy, but they are not fanciful. They belong to the known world of ancient heavy transport. Getting a box into the underground galleries remains one of the more difficult details. Mainstream explanations often suggest ramps, sledges, levers, and possibly sand-based lowering methods. Sand is especially interesting because it can act as a controllable support. If a heavy object rests on packed sand, removing sand gradually can lower the object without needing to suspend its full weight from above. Similar principles appear in various ancient moving and lowering problems. Again, the method is not glamorous, it does not glow, it does not hum, but it has the great advantage of being physically plausible and materially available. The ancient Egyptians had sand, gravity and patience in quantities that would make any project manager nervous but impressed. The mainstream view also points out that ancient stoneworking was not always as clean and perfect as dramatic presentations suggest. Unfinished monuments, quarry marks, rough surfaces, tool scars, and abandoned objects show process. They show mistakes. They show stages. They show that Egyptians did not simply produce flawless stone objects by mysterious means. They worked, corrected, adapted, and sometimes stopped. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan, for example, is a famous reminder that even great projects could fail when stone cracked. That failure is useful evidence because it shows method and limitation. A lost super machine would presumably avoid some of these problems, though perhaps even ancient super machines had bad Mondays. The archaeological record shows a world of skilled craft under real constraints. None of this means every mainstream explanation is complete in every detail. Archaeology often works with partial evidence. A technique may be known generally, but not reconstructed step by step for one specific object. A tool may be inferred from marks and parallels rather than found beside the stone it made. A transport route may be likely but not fully preserved. The Serapeum boxes deserve careful study precisely because they are difficult. But mainstream Egyptology does not need to pretend the work was easy. Its argument is that the work was possible within the technological and social world of ancient Egypt, using methods we know existed, or can reasonably infer from related evidence. Possible is not the same as simple. A mountain climb is possible, but that does not make it a staircase. There is also a philosophical difference in how explanations are weighed. Archaeology tends to prefer explanations that require the fewest unsupported additions. If copper tools, hard stone pounders, abrasives, measuring methods, sledges, ramps, and organised labour can explain the work, then there is no need to add a lost power source unless the evidence demands it. This is not because archaeologists dislike wonder, despite what some late-night comment sections may suggest. It is because evidence has to carry the weight of a claim. The heavier the claim, the stronger the evidence needed. A granite sarcophagus weighing many tons is physically heavy. A claim of vanished advanced machining is historically heavy. Both need support. At the same time, it is unhelpful to mock every question about the boxes. Wonder is often where investigation begins. Someone looks at a smooth granite surface and says, "How?" That's a good question. The answer may be copper, sand, pounding stones, emery, water, measuring cords, and time. But the question itself is not foolish. It becomes foolish only when it refuses to listen to evidence, or when it leaps from difficulty to certainty without doing the slow work in between. A serious look at the Serapeum should be able to say two things at once. First, ancient Egyptian stoneworkers had practical methods capable of shaping hard stone. Second, the scale and finish of these sarcophagi are impressive enough that we should keep studying them carefully. Those two statements are not enemies. They can sit together quite comfortably, perhaps sharing a pot of tea and a small plate of biscuits, though the granite may decline. The mainstream explanation, then, is not a single tool, but a chain of actions. Quarry the stone, rough it out with pounders and other tools, saw where needed with copper and abrasive, drill where useful with tubular tools and grit, grind surfaces with progressively finer abrasives, check alignment with simple measuring devices, polish by repeated abrasion, move the object with sledges, ropes, ramps, prepared surfaces and labour, lower or position it through controlled methods, fit the lid, seal the burial. Repeat over generations as the cult continues and the galleries grow. It is not quick, and it is not casual, but it belongs to a world we can recognise archaeologically. It leaves marks we can compare. It depends on materials known in ancient Egypt. It demands skill, but not necessarily lost machinery. And perhaps that is the most important part of the conventional answer. It does not reduce the Egyptians to people banging rocks together in confusion. It gives them credit for craft, planning, and endurance. Modern fascination with lost technology sometimes begins from admiration, but it can accidentally take achievement away from the people who left it behind. If a surface is too good, we say it must be someone else's technology. If a stone is too heavy, we say it must require a machine. If a cut is too clean, we say ancient hands could not have made it. But ancient hands, trained over years and supported by a powerful society, could do extraordinary things. The tools may have been simple, the knowledge was not. Still, the stones themselves keep pulling us onward, because an explanation is strongest when it meets the evidence directly. The next layer of the question lies in the marks preserved on granite and other hard stones. Saw lines, drill cores, grooves, polished planes, rough patches, and unfinished traces all matter. If copper, sand, and stone pounders were the main actors, they should leave one kind of signature. If something more unusual was involved, it should leave another. The mainstream case asks us to see the Serapeum not as an impossible object, but as the difficult result of known techniques used with unusual dedication. The more speculative case asks whether some of the marks do not fit that picture neatly. To sort those claims, we have to move closer to the stone itself, close enough that the mystery is no longer measured only in tons, but in scratches, grooves, angles, and the stubborn little details that tools leave behind. Once we stop looking only at the size of the Serapeum boxes, the mystery becomes smaller, but not simpler. It moves from the weight of stone to the surface of stone, from the question of how anyone moved these things to the quieter question of what touched them. A stone surface is not blank if you know how to read it. It can hold scratches, grooves, polish, bruises, chips, drill marks, rough patches, and tiny changes in texture that tell a patient observer something about the tools that passed over it. Granite may seem silent, but it is not entirely forgetful. It records contact. It remembers pressure. It keeps the faint signatures of work, even when the workers, ropes, tools, and workshop sounds have vanished so completely that only the stone remains to be cross-examined. This is where ancient stonework becomes almost forensic. A detective might look for fingerprints on a glass. A stone specialist looks for tool marks on a cut face. The clues are not always dramatic. They may be shallow parallel lines left by abrasive sawing. They may be circular grooves from a drill. They may be a change in surface sheen where rough grinding gave way to finer polishing. They may be little crescent-shaped bruises from pounding stones, or faint ripples where a tool moved repeatedly in the same direction. To most of us, these marks are just marks. To someone trained to study stone, they are the grammar of manufacture. Of course, like all grammar, they can lead to arguments, especially when granite is involved and everyone in the room believes they are being very reasonable. The Serapeum boxes invite this kind of close looking, because their scale is so large that the making process must have left evidence somewhere. A massive granite container does not become rectangular, hollow, smooth, and fitted by accident. It has to be reduced from a rough block into an ordered form. That reduction involves contact over and over again. Something struck the stone, something dragged across it, something ground it down, something polished it. Even if later finishing removed many rougher traces, not every stage can be erased perfectly. Corners, damaged areas, undersides, broken lids, unfinished patches and less visible surfaces may preserve hints of the work. The question is whether those hints fit comfortably with copper, stone pounders, sand, water and abrasives, or whether they point towards a more unusual method. When people speak of strange marks in ancient Egyptian granite, they're often not speaking only about the Serapeum. They're drawing from a wider body of Egyptian hard stone evidence, drilled holes, saw cuts, unfinished objects, stone vessels, statues, sarcophagi, and quarry traces from different sites and periods. This wider evidence matters because a tool tradition does not exist at only one monument. If ancient workers used tubular drills, abrasive saws, pounding stones and grinding methods, we should expect to see related marks across many objects, and we do. There are drill holes and cores from Egypt that show circular cutting. There are saw marks on stone. There are unfinished pieces where the process is easier to see because the final polish has not tidied everything away. The Serapeum therefore belongs to a bigger technical world, not a lone miracle dropped into the sand like someone misplaced a granite refrigerator. One of the most famous pieces in this wider discussion is the granite drill core associated with Flinders Petrie's work at Giza. It has often been discussed because of the spiral marks visible on it, marks that some writers have interpreted as evidence of very fast drilling or a surprisingly aggressive cutting rate. In the more speculative version of the argument, those spirals are treated almost like the grooves left by a modern machine tool, suggesting that the ancient drill advanced into granite with a speed and pressure that hand-powered copper and sand could not easily explain. It is an exciting image. An ancient tool biting into hard granite with mechanical confidence, turning steadily, cutting deeply, leaving behind a core that seems to whisper of lost machinery. But as always, the whisper needs to be checked before it becomes a speech. Mainstream interpretations are more cautious. A tubular drill working with abrasive slurry can leave grooves and striations as it rotates. The exact appearance of those marks depends on many things: abrasive grain size, pressure, tool wobble, tool wear, speed, slurry thickness, the changing contact between the tube and stone, and the way the core breaks or is removed. A spiral mark does not automatically mean a powered drill in the modern sense. It may reflect the movement of abrasive trapped under a rotating tube, or the path of harder grains as they score the stone. Experiments with copper tubes and abrasives have shown that hard stone can be drilled this way, though slowly. That does not make every ancient drill mark fully explained in every detail, but it does mean we should not jump from "this looks machine-like" to "there must have been a machine" in one cheerful leap, like a frog wearing a lab coat. Saw marks are another source of fascination. A long straight cut in hard stone can look very modern, especially when the cut face is flat and the striations run in a neat direction. The ancient method usually proposed is a copper or copper alloy saw used with sand or another abrasive. Again, the metal blade is not the hero on its own. The abrasive does the cutting. The saw carries it, pushes it, drags it, keeps it moving in the groove. The marks left by such a process may appear as parallel lines or fine scratches, depending on finishing and preservation. If the stone was later ground or polished, the clearest marks may be removed, leaving only traces in areas that were abandoned, hidden or broken open later. That is why unfinished cuts are so valuable. Finished surfaces are often polite. Unfinished surfaces are more likely to tell the embarrassing truth about how the job was done. The trouble is that ancient surfaces are rarely preserved under laboratory conditions. They have been weathered, buried, handled, damaged, cleaned, photographed, touched by visitors, and sometimes interpreted through a great deal of expectation. If a person arrives believing the marks must prove advanced technology, their eye may connect every groove into a machine signature. If another person arrives determined that nothing unusual can possibly be present, their eye may flatten every clue into ordinary abrasion. The stone itself is not helped by either attitude. It needs measurement, magnification, comparison, controlled experiments. It needs someone to ask, what marks do known methods leave? What marks do modern methods leave? And where exactly does this ancient surface belong in that range? On the Serapeum boxes, the most discussed features are often the flatness of surfaces, the regularity of edges, the smoothness of interiors, and the fitting of lids. Some visitors report that the granite appears so accurate that it must have been made with advanced measuring and cutting systems. Others point out that close inspection reveals variations, rougher patches, damage, and surfaces that are impressive but not beyond patient hand finishing. This disagreement is not surprising. A polished stone plane can be visually deceptive. Human eyes are excellent at noticing broad impressions and terrible at measuring tolerances without instruments. A surface can look flat while gently wandering. A corner can look square while being only approximately so. A lid can look perfectly fitted because the dark chamber hides the gaps. On the other hand, some surfaces may indeed be very well finished, and that should not be dismissed. The right response is not to guess harder. It is to measure better. There is also a difference between precision and polish. A surface may be smooth to the touch because it has been polished with fine abrasives, but that does not necessarily mean it is geometrically perfect. Think of a pebble in a river. It can be wonderfully smooth while not being flat at all. Or think of a hand-polished tabletop that feels silky, but still has small variations when checked with a straight edge. The Serapeum boxes may combine different qualities: large-scale straightness, local smoothness, heavy mass, and careful finishing. Each quality has to be examined separately. Calling all of it precision can be too vague. It sounds impressive, but it may hide the exact question that needs answering. Precision of what? Flatness, squareness, parallelism, surface roughness, lid fit, interior volume? Without that detail, the word becomes a fog machine with a ruler attached. Some of the most interesting traces may not be on the most beautiful surfaces at all. They may be in damage. When a sarcophagus was broken open, the fracture could reveal wall thickness, grain structure, and perhaps earlier working stages. When a lid cracked, it could show whether the underside was finished as carefully as the top. When a corner was chipped, it might expose whether polish was superficial or whether shaping went deep. Archaeologists often learn from broken things because breakage reveals layers. A perfect object stands there looking dignified and uncooperative. A damaged object, though unfortunate, sometimes tells you how it was made. It is a little rude, perhaps, but scientifically useful, like someone accidentally dropping a cake and revealing the filling. The interior corners are especially worth thinking about because they are difficult to make in hard stone. A broad flat surface can be ground with a stone or abrasive tool moved repeatedly across it. A tight internal corner is less friendly. It requires smaller tools, more controlled work and careful checking. If the Serapeum boxes have sharp interior corners, that raises practical questions. How were they finished? Were drill holes used to remove material near the corners? Were narrow grinding tools used? Were the corners actually as sharp as they appear, or are they rounded more than photographs suggest? Ancient stone vessels often show remarkable hollowing skill, and Egyptian craftsmen were capable of working interiors in hard materials. But scaling that skill up to giant sarcophagi makes the question more demanding. The principle may be similar. The labour becomes enormous. Tool marks can also tell us about stages of confidence. Rough shaping leaves broad scars. Finer shaping leaves smaller ones. Polishing removes or softens earlier traces. If an object was made quickly or left unfinished, the marks may be obvious. If it was made for a high-status ritual purpose, later finishing may have erased much of the rough story. The Serapeum boxes likely passed through a long sequence of treatments. First, the stone had to be made into a rough form. Then the shape had to be corrected. Then surfaces had to be refined. Then the final finish had to be applied, at least where it mattered. This means the visible marks may be only the last pages of a long book. Reading the final polish and trying to reconstruct the quarry stage is possible, but it is not easy. It is rather like judging an entire meal from the last crumb on the plate, though depending on the crumb, some of us would still try. Alternative interpretations often focus on marks that seem too regular. Regularity feels mechanical to modern eyes. If lines are evenly spaced, if grooves appear consistent, if a cut face looks smooth, we think of machines because our own world produces regularity through machines. But regularity can also come from repeated hand action guided by simple constraints. A saw held in a groove is guided by the groove itself. A tube drill is guided by its circular cut. A grinding tool moved along a plane tends to follow that plane. Workers may use straight edges, guidelines, cords, wooden frames, or repeated checking. The process can become self-correcting to some degree. Once a surface is close to flat, high spots reveal themselves under grinding. Once a cut has begun, it channels the tool. This does not make the work easy. It makes regularity possible without electricity. There is another important caution. A modern machine does not always leave a single unmistakable mark, and an ancient hand tool does not always leave a messy one. The boundary between handmade and machine-like can be surprisingly blurry. A skilled craftsperson can produce clean, even work. A poorly controlled machine can chatter, wobble, and leave irregular marks. Tool marks are not judged by one feature alone. They are judged by patterns. A saw mark, drill mark, or polish signature must be understood in relation to the tool geometry, material, abrasive, motion, and surrounding context. This is why serious analysis can be slow. It has to resist the thrill of a quick conclusion, which is difficult because quick conclusions are very satisfying. They are the biscuits of the thinking world. Nice at first, but not really a meal. The claim that some ancient Egyptian marks resemble ultrasonic machining belongs to this same problem of pattern recognition. In modern ultrasonic machining, a vibrating tool and abrasive slurry remove material from hard, brittle substances. The process can leave characteristic surfaces depending on conditions. Some writers have suggested that certain ancient marks or finishes resemble the effect of high-frequency vibration rather than hand sawing or grinding. It is an interesting comparison, but resemblance alone is not proof. Many processes can create superficially similar textures. Abrasive slurry moved by hand, rotating tools, vibrating impacts, and later polishing can all produce marks that require careful analysis to distinguish. To argue for ultrasonic cutting, one would need more than smooth granite and unusual grooves. One would need a consistent set of diagnostic features, evidence of tools or energy sources, and experiments showing that known ancient methods cannot reproduce the marks. That last part is essential. Before saying a mark cannot be made by copper and abrasive, one has to try very hard to make it by copper and abrasive, and not in a casual way. The experiment must use suitable stone, appropriate abrasive, realistic tool materials, plausible pressure, enough time, and careful documentation. If an experiment fails after an hour, that may not mean the ancient method fails. It may mean the experimenter has not yet matched the ancient worker's technique, patience, or setup. On the other hand, if repeated well-designed experiments cannot reproduce a certain mark, then the question becomes more interesting. This is how mystery should develop, not by ignoring conventional explanations, but by testing them until they either work or reveal their limits. One of the strongest points in favour of known abrasive methods is that they leave behind a broader archaeological world that makes sense. We have evidence for ancient Egyptian stone tools, metal tools, saws, chisels, drill marks, cores, quarrying traces and unfinished pieces. We have hard stone objects in many forms, from vessels to statues to sarcophagi. We have evidence that abrasive technology was understood. We have experiments showing that copper tubes and abrasives can drill granite. That does not answer every detail at the Serapeum, but it gives the mainstream explanation routes. Lost advanced technology, by contrast, often appears as a solution floating above the evidence. It explains the impressive result, but then has to explain why the surrounding system is missing. Where are the tools, the workshops, the power devices, the waste products, the transitional examples, the repairs, the training marks, the accidents? Even lost technologies tend to leave rubbish, and archaeology is very fond of rubbish, because rubbish tells the truth more often than monuments do. Still, the absence of obvious machines does not end every question. A lost craft method could leave few tools behind if the tools were recyclable, perishable, or later melted down. Copper was valuable and often reused. Wooden frames rot, ropes decay, abrasive slurry washes away or becomes ordinary dust. A clever guiding system made of wood and cord might vanish completely, while the granite it shaped remains. This is why a cautious position is best. The Serapeum does not require us to imagine modern industry in ancient Egypt, but it does invite us to consider that ancient practical methods may have been more varied and refined than the surviving evidence immediately shows. Lost knowledge is not always spectacular. Sometimes it's a jig, a frame, a sequence of motions, a recipe for abrasive slurry, or a way of training workers to feel flatness with their hands. The marks in granite also remind us that ancient technology was physical knowledge. It was not only ideas, it lived in repeated contact between tool and material. A worker learned how much pressure made the abrasive cut instead of clog, how wet the slurry should be, how to hear a change in the tool's movement, how to keep a saw from wandering, how to correct a surface that was drifting out of line, how to polish without ruining an edge. These details may never have been written down because they did not need to be. They were taught beside the stone. A young worker watched an older worker, then tried, then failed, then tried again. Eventually the body learned what the text never recorded. When that chain of teaching ends, the method becomes invisible, even if the result remains in plain sight. So when we look at the Serapeum boxes, the tool marks should not be treated as decorations on a mystery. They are the route into the mystery. They are more important than the dramatic weight estimates, and more useful than vague claims of impossibility. A scratch can be better evidence than a legend. A drill groove can be more honest than a theory. If the granite shows ordinary abrasive wear, then the story becomes one of extreme patience and skill. If it shows marks that consistently resist known explanations, then the story becomes one of missing technique. But either way, the stone itself must lead. Not the desire for a lost civilization, not the desire to protect a conventional answer, the stone. And perhaps that is the quietest strange thing of all. The more closely we look, the less the Serapeum feels like a simple yes or no puzzle. It becomes a layered problem. Some marks may fit known methods, some may be harder to explain, some claims may dissolve under measurement, others may survive long enough to deserve better experiments. The boxes may not be perfect, but they may still be remarkable. The tools may not have been advanced in the modern sense, but the technique may have been advanced in the human sense, built from repetition, observation, and stubbornness. Granite does not yield to fantasy, it yields to process. The real question is what process left its fingerprints in the stone, and whether some of those fingerprints look less like slow scraping and more like something vibrating, pulsing, or cutting in a way that has made certain researchers wonder if an ancient tool once touched granite with a rhythm we have not yet fully understood. There is a certain kind of mystery that begins not with a missing object, but with a mark that seems to be in the wrong century, a groove in stone, a surface that looks too smooth, a drilled hole that appears too regular, a line that makes the modern eye pause for just a little longer than expected. At the Serapeum, the great stone boxes are already impressive because of their size, but the idea that has made them especially famous in alternative discussions is not only that they were moved or hollowed, it is that some people believe the stone may preserve the trace of a lost cutting process, something that worked less like a simple saw dragged through sand and more like a vibrating tool, pulsing against granite with a rhythm too fast for the ear to hear. This is where the word ultrasonic enters the story, and it arrives with a certain dramatic confidence. Ultrasonic cutting, or more properly ultrasonic machining, is a real modern process. It is not fantasy. In modern workshops and laboratories, high-frequency vibration can be used with abrasive slurry to shape hard, brittle materials. The tool vibrates very rapidly. Abrasive particles suspended in liquid strike the surface again and again. Each tiny impact removes a tiny piece of material. No single particle does anything heroic, but millions of little impacts repeated at high speed can slowly erode glass, ceramics, gemstones, and other stubborn materials that do not respond kindly to ordinary cutting. It is a method based less on slicing and more on controlled microscopic battering, like convincing a mountain to move by sending it a very persistent swarm of gnats with engineering qualifications. The reason this idea attracts attention in discussions of ancient Egyptian granite is easy to understand. Granite is hard. It is brittle in certain ways. It resists soft tools. Ultrasonic machining is useful for hard, brittle materials. The Serapeum boxes are made from hard stone and have surfaces that some observers consider unusually smooth or precise. Put those thoughts close together, add a few photographs, a few claims about tool marks, and a sense that mainstream explanations are too ordinary for objects this imposing, and the suggestion begins to form. Perhaps some say the Egyptians were not merely grinding and sawing with copper and sand. Perhaps they had a way to vibrate tools. Perhaps they discovered a mechanical principle that was later forgotten. Perhaps the boxes are not only tomb furniture, but the last quiet evidence of a lost machine. It is an exciting idea. It is also a very demanding one. A lost machine is not a small claim. It cannot rest only on the feeling that a surface looks too good. It cannot rest only on the fact that granite is hard, or that modern people find the work inconvenient to imagine. It has to explain the marks in a way that known methods cannot. It has to show that the pattern in the stone matches the claimed process more closely than it matches sawing, drilling, pounding, grinding, polishing, and abrasive work by hand. It has to explain what powered the vibration, what the tool was made of, how it was controlled, how it was maintained, and why the surrounding evidence of such a technology is so faint. A stone box may be heavy, but a claim can be heavier. Still, before we become too skeptical too quickly, it is worth giving the idea its proper shape. The strongest version of the ultrasonic argument does not simply say, "This stone is smooth, therefore lost technology." That would be far too easy, and if smoothness alone proved advanced machinery, then every polished pebble on a beach would be a suspicious artifact, which would make seaside holidays much more complicated. The more serious version looks at tool marks. It asks whether certain grooves, striations, drill cores, or cut surfaces show signs of rapid, consistent material removal. It asks whether some marks appear more like the result of a fixed tool moving with mechanical regularity, than the result of a hand-powered tool carrying loose abrasive. It asked whether the stone records not just abrasion, but vibration. This is where the famous drill cores from Egypt often enter the discussion, even though they are not the Serapeum boxes themselves. The argument is usually expanded to include broader ancient Egyptian stonework, granite cores, drill holes, saw cuts, and hard stone objects from different sites. Some early observers, including Flinders Petrie, noticed features in drilled cores that seemed remarkable. Later writers became especially interested in spiral grooves on cores, interpreting them as possible evidence of a drill advancing into stone at a rate that seemed unusually high. If a tube drill makes one full turn and also moves downward significantly during that turn, that can look like a feed rate, the kind of measurement an engineer might associate with machine drilling. And once that language appears, the imagination begins to furnish the ancient workshop with equipment it may never have had. A cautious response is not to dismiss the grooves, but to ask what else could make them. In abrasive tube drilling, a copper tube rotates against stone while abrasive slurry sits between the tool and the surface. Hard grains trapped under the tube can scratch, crush, and score the stone. If the tool wobbles, if the pressure changes, if abrasive grains become embedded, if the tube shifts, or if the worker changes rhythm, the marks can become uneven, spiral-like, or unexpectedly deep. The core itself is not always a clean record of steady mechanical motion. It is the result of a messy contact between tool, grit, stone, water, pressure, and human effort. A groove may look like a single-point cutting tool fed by a machine, but it may also be the path of abrasive particles behaving badly, which is something abrasive particles are fully capable of doing without needing electricity. The same caution applies to saw cuts. A long groove in hard stone can look machine-made, especially if the sides appear straight and the cut is deep. But a saw held in a groove is partly guided by that groove. Repeated back and forth motion can produce regularity. Abrasive slurry can leave lines. A team pulling a saw may create rhythm. Rhythm is not the same as ultrasonic vibration, of course, but it is regular motion. Ancient tools did not have to be random simply because they were hand-powered. A worker using a bow drill creates repeated rotation. A team using a long saw creates repeated linear motion. A grinder moving across a surface creates repeated paths. Repetition is the parent of many marks that later generations may mistake for machines. And yet, the ultrasonic comparison keeps returning because it offers a clean answer to a frustrating material. In modern ultrasonic machining, the vibrating tool does not need to be harder than the workpiece in the ordinary cutting sense. The abrasive particles do the damage. The tool supplies motion and shape. That sounds oddly similar to part of the mainstream explanation, where copper tools guide abrasive sand or other grit. The difference is speed and energy. A hand-powered copper saw with abrasive works slowly. An ultrasonic tool vibrates at very high frequency and can concentrate repeated impacts into a controlled area. If someone is already convinced that the ancient marks show unusually rapid cutting, ultrasonic machining becomes attractive because it explains how a softer tool might work on harder stone more effectively. But then we have to ask the awkward question that tends to sit quietly in the corner until everyone has finished admiring the theory. What powered it? Modern ultrasonic machining requires a transducer to convert electrical energy into mechanical vibration. It requires control of frequency, amplitude, pressure, slurry, and tool contact. It uses materials and systems that belong to a wider technological world. If ancient Egypt had an equivalent process, even a non-electrical one, we would expect some supporting evidence. Perhaps vibrating frames, resonant devices, specialized tool holders, unusual wear patterns on tools, workshop remains, written references that are not merely poetic or religious, repeated diagnostic marks across many objects, evidence of experimentation, evidence of failure. Technologies do not usually appear as perfect finished results and then vanish without leaving at least a little mess behind. Human beings leave messes. It is one of our most reliable archaeological contributions. Some have suggested that the vibration might not have been electrical at all. Perhaps it came from sound, resonance, mechanical oscillation, water power, or some kind of unknown acoustic device. Ancient people understood sound, music, rhythm, and resonance in practical ways. They built instruments. They struck stone. They heard how objects rang. It is not absurd to imagine that they noticed vibration. Anyone who has held a tool against stone knows that vibration travels through the body. Anyone who has dragged a chair across a floor has conducted an accidental experiment in unpleasant acoustics. But noticing vibration is not the same as building a controlled ultrasonic machining system. The distance between those two things is large, and it should not be crossed by enthusiasm alone. There is also the matter of scale. Modern ultrasonic machining is often used for smaller, controlled operations, shaping hard materials with specific tool forms. The Serapeum boxes are enormous. Hollowing and finishing a massive sarcophagus would involve removing large volumes of stone and creating broad surfaces. If a lost ultrasonic method were used, was it used for everything or only for finishing? Was it used to cut the rough shape, drill out material, polish the surfaces, or fit the lids? A theory becomes stronger when it defines its job. Saying ultrasonic technology made the boxes is too vague. Which marks require it? Which stages show it? Which surfaces preserve it? Where does ordinary pounding end and advanced vibration begin? Without those boundaries, the theory becomes a net thrown over the entire mystery, catching too much and explaining too little. A more modest possibility is that ancient craftsmen used forms of percussion, vibration, or resonant movement that were not ultrasonic in the modern sense, but still more sophisticated than we usually imagine. Perhaps some tools were worked rhythmically in frames. Perhaps certain abrasive techniques produced vibrations that improved cutting. Perhaps there were drill designs, bow mechanisms, weighted systems, or teamwork methods that created more consistent motion than a lone worker turning a tube by hand. These ideas are less dramatic than a hidden power source, but they are often more historically plausible. Lost technique does not need to be a vanished industrial age. It can be a clever mechanical trick made from wood, rope, stone, copper, and experience. The ancient world was full of such tricks, many of which look simple only after someone has already invented them. This distinction matters because the phrase lost technology can mislead us. If by lost technology we mean laser cutters, electric motors, and high-frequency transducers humming beneath the desert, the evidence is weak. If by lost technology we mean craft methods, tool setups, abrasive recipes, measuring practices and workshop habits not fully preserved in the archaeological record, the idea becomes much more reasonable. There are many lost technologies in that sense. Ancient dyes whose exact recipes are uncertain. Metallurgical tricks passed through workshops, mortar mixtures, polishing methods, rigging techniques, and agricultural practices that were once ordinary and later forgotten. Human history is full of knowledge that lived in practice rather than writing. It disappears not because it was magical, but because the people who knew it stopped teaching it. The Serapeum therefore sits between two temptations. One temptation is to inflate every unexplained mark into evidence of a machine. The other is to flatten every difficult observation into just sand and time, without asking enough practical questions. Both temptations are understandable. The first gives us wonder, the second gives us order. But the stone deserves something slower. It deserves a method that can say, this mark is consistent with abrasive sawing. This surface may be hand-polished. This groove needs better measurement. This claim about ultrasonic cutting is not demonstrated. This ancient craft tradition may have been more advanced than the simple tools suggest. That kind of answer is less dramatic, but it is more useful. It leaves room for mystery without letting the mystery run around the room, knocking over the furniture. The strongest evidence against a full ultrasonic machine interpretation is not that ancient Egyptians were incapable. That would be a poor argument and an unfair one. Ancient Egyptians were capable of extraordinary engineering. The stronger issue is that technologies exist inside systems. Modern ultrasonic machining is supported by knowledge of electricity, materials, precision control, machine construction, and power conversion. If something equivalent existed in the ancient world, it would likely leave more than ambiguous stone marks. We would expect a technological ecology around it. Tools with distinctive wear, production areas, failed pieces showing the process, texts or images that become clearer when read technically, objects from other materials shaped in the same way. At present, the evidence most often presented is not enough to carry that weight. It may raise questions, but it does not yet build the machine. The strongest evidence in favour of continued curiosity is that ancient stoneworking remains difficult to reconstruct in full practical detail. Experiments can show that copper and abrasives work, but experiments do not always match the exact conditions of ancient workshops. Modern experimenters may not have the same skill, tools, time, abrasive selection, or social organisation. A method that looks painfully slow in a short test could become more efficient with trained teams and generations of refinement. Or, conversely, certain ancient marks may reveal methods not yet properly recreated. Both possibilities require more experimental work, not louder certainty. The stone is patient. It will wait for better questions. There is also a psychological reason ultrasonic theories are so appealing. They make the ancient world feel closer to our own. A copper saw with sand belongs to a world of muscle and patience. An ultrasonic tool belongs to a world of frequency, engineering, hidden forces, and invisible power. It sounds modern. It gives the past a secret sophistication that flatters our imagination. We like the idea that history contains lost versions of ourselves, people who knew something we know, or perhaps something we have forgotten. There is nothing wrong with that feeling. It is part of why ancient mysteries are so compelling. But feelings are not measurements. A theory can be emotionally satisfying and still be wrong, just as a biscuit can be emotionally satisfying and still not count as dinner, despite repeated personal experiments. If we stand again inside the Serapeum and imagine the boxes not as proof but as evidence, the ultrasonic idea becomes a question rather than an answer. Could vibration have played some role in ancient stoneworking? Possibly, in the broad sense that many tools vibrate, resonate, chatter, and pulse during use. Could ancient craftsmen have exploited rhythmic movement more cleverly than we often assume? That is worth considering. Could the Serapeum boxes demonstrate a modern-style ultrasonic machining system with an unknown power source? That is far more difficult to support. The difference between those questions is important. One opens a door to practical investigation, the other builds a palace on a doorstep. A careful investigator would want to study the surfaces directly, not only with photographs, but with high-resolution scanning, microscopy, surface profilometry, residue analysis, and controlled comparison to experimental samples. Make cuts in similar granite using copper and quartz, make others with emery, try corundum, use tube drills, use saws, use pounding and grinding, use modern ultrasonic machining on comparable stone, then compare the marks without deciding the answer in advance. Are the grooves similar? Are the fracture patterns similar? Does the polish match? Are abrasive grains embedded? Is there evidence of repeated impact at a scale that differs from ordinary abrasion? Only this kind of work can move the discussion forward. Otherwise, we're simply standing in a tunnel arguing with granite, and granite has never been known for its conversational flexibility. This kind of testing might produce an answer less dramatic than either side expects. It may show that many supposedly impossible marks can be reproduced with known methods. It may also show that some methods need to be refined beyond the simple textbook version. Maybe the Egyptians used harder abrasives more often than once assumed. Maybe they selected sand carefully. Maybe they used tool guides that have not survived. Maybe teams achieved surprisingly consistent pressure and motion. Maybe certain surfaces were finished to a high degree because religious objects demanded it. None of this requires a power source. but all of it expands our respect for ancient technical ability. Sometimes the lost machine is not a device at all. Sometimes it is the trained human system that knew how to make the device unnecessary. The Serapeum boxes do not hum now. If they ever did, it was not in any way we can easily hear. They sit in their chambers with the calm weight of objects that have outlived every explanation offered to them. The claim of ultrasonic cutting is interesting because it asks us to take tool marks seriously. It asks us to look not only at what was made, but how stone was persuaded to change. But it becomes misleading when it turns resemblance into proof, or when it assumes that modern-looking results must require modern-like machines. Ancient Egypt does not need hidden electricity to be impressive. It already had skilled labour, organised religion, powerful institutions, quarry knowledge, measuring traditions, abrasive techniques, and a long familiarity with stone. That is not a small toolkit. It is a civilization's toolkit. And yet, the matter of abrasives refuses to stay in the background. Whether we're discussing hand sawing, tube drilling, polishing, or even the more speculative idea of vibration-assisted cutting, the cutting agent is often not the copper tool itself, but the hard mineral grains trapped between tool and stone. Sand matters, quartz matters, emery matters, corundum matters. A theory about ancient stonework that ignores abrasives is like a recipe that forgets the flour, and then wonders why the cake is philosophical rather than edible. So before we decide whether the marks in granite remember a lost machine, we need to look more closely at the tiny hard particles that may have done most of the work, because in the story of Egyptian stone, the smallest grains may have carried the greatest force. The closer we look at ancient Egyptian stonework, the more important the small things become. Not the great blocks, not the long corridors, not the sarcophagi that seem to have borrowed their confidence from mountains, but grains. Tiny grains. Hard grains. Bits of mineral small enough to sit unnoticed in dust, yet hard enough to change the face of granite when pressed and dragged again and again. If the Serapeum boxes feel like a mystery written in stone, then abrasives may be the quiet alphabet behind that writing. They do not look dramatic. They do not gleam like bronze tools or stand in museums with labels that say Royal Instrument. They are just powder, sand, grit, and crushed mineral. But in the world of hard stone, grit is not a detail. It is the part that does the work. This is why the phrase copper tools can be so misleading. It makes the ancient craft sound weaker than it was. Copper alone is soft compared with granite. If someone imagines an Egyptian worker trying to shave granite with a copper blade, as though slicing a cucumber, the whole process seems absurd. But that is not how abrasive cutting works. The copper tool, or bronze tool in later periods, can act as a guide, a carrier, a frame, or a moving surface. The actual cutting comes from hard mineral particles trapped between the tool and the stone. Those particles scratch, crush, bruise, and wear away the surface bit by bit. If the abrasive is hard enough, and if the worker supplies enough pressure, motion, water, and time, a soft tool can help shape a hard stone. The softness of the tool is not the whole story. In fact, focusing only on the metal is a little like judging a cup of tea by the spoon and forgetting the tea. Granite is difficult because it is not one uniform substance. It is a mixture of minerals, commonly including quartz, feldspar and mica, interlocked as crystals. Quartz is hard. Feldspar is also fairly hard. The stone has grain and structure, and that means it does not behave exactly like a block of clay or a piece of wood. It can chip, fracture, polish, resist, and wear unevenly. When an abrasive grain moves across granite under pressure, it may scratch one mineral, loosen another, or break off a tiny fragment where crystals meet. Over a long period, those microscopic actions become visible change. A surface becomes flatter, a groove becomes deeper, a rough face becomes smooth. The process is slow, but slow is not the same as weak. Water dripping on stone is slow too, and given enough time, even water can become rather persuasive. Quartz sand is often mentioned in explanations of Egyptian stoneworking because quartz is common and hard enough to abrade many materials. On the Mohs hardness scale, quartz sits at about 7, while copper is much lower. Corundum, however, is much harder, at 9. Only diamond is famously higher on that simple scale. Emery, a natural abrasive rock that can include corundum along with other minerals, was known in the ancient world and has long been used for grinding and polishing. If ancient Egyptian workers had access to corundum-rich abrasive material in some contexts, then the question of hard stone working becomes more interesting. The work does not become easy, of course. Nothing about hollowing a huge granite sarcophagus becomes easy, because someone sprinkles a clever powder on it. But the gap between soft metal and hard stone becomes less mysterious when the real cutting agent is a mineral harder than much of the stone being worked. This is one reason the debate over abrasives matters so much. A person who says, "Copper cannot cut granite," may be correct in one narrow sense and still miss the actual method. A copper saw without abrasive would be a sad little performance. It would wear, bend, and complain in the language of metal. A copper saw with quartz, sand, water, and pressure becomes part of a different system. A copper tube drill with abrasive slurry can grind into granite. A flat grinding stone with abrasive can slowly level a surface. A polishing stage using finer and finer particles can create a finish that seems surprisingly refined. The tool is not a modern blade. The tool is a moving holder for controlled damage. It is less like cutting with a knife and more like wearing away the stone through patient directed erosion. This does not remove the mystery of the Serapeum boxes, but it changes the shape of it. The question is no longer simply, could copper cut granite? That is too simple. The better question is, what abrasives were used? How were they prepared? How were they applied? How was pressure controlled? How were surfaces checked? And how much time and skill did the process require? These are practical questions. They are not as flashy as a lost power source, but they are often where the real engineering lives. Ancient technology does not always announce itself with complicated parts. Sometimes it is a mixture in a bowl, a tool held at the right angle, a rhythm learned through years of work, and a foreman with the patience to tell everyone to do the same motion again, only better. Polish is another word that needs careful handling. When people speak of impossible polish on ancient granite, they may mean several different things. They may mean the surface looks smooth. They may mean it reflects light. They may mean it feels even to the touch. They may mean it appears flat, straight, and regular. These are related qualities, but they are not identical. A surface can be highly polished and still not perfectly flat. A curved stone can shine beautifully. A river pebble can feel smooth without being geometrically precise. On the other hand, a surface can be quite flat without being highly polished. Modern people often combine these qualities in the word precision because we associate smooth, flat, reflective surfaces with machines. But a hand-polished object can look machine-like if enough care has gone into it. The eye is impressed by finish, but finish alone does not tell us the method. Ancient Egyptian craftsmen were extremely good at finish. This can be seen not only in monumental stonework but in hard stone vessels, statues, palettes, beads, amulets, and polished surfaces across many periods. Small stone vessels are especially important because they show a long tradition of shaping and hollowing hard material with great control. Some of these objects have thin walls, smooth interiors, and elegant forms. They are not Serapeum sarcophagi, of course, but they show that Egyptian artisans were familiar with abrasion, drilling, grinding, and polishing at a very high level. Scale changes the problem, but it does not erase the tradition. If a craft culture knows how to shape hard stone beautifully on smaller objects, it is not surprising that state-supported, sacred, monumental projects could push those skills into larger and more demanding forms. The patient hand explanation is sometimes treated as if it is an insult, as though saying something was made by hand means it must be rough, uneven, and simple. But skilled handwork can be astonishing. a trained craftsperson can detect tiny changes by touch. They can see high spots in a surface from the way light skims across it. They can hear differences in sound when a tool meets a different density or angle. They can repeat a movement thousands of times with small corrections. Over months or years, those corrections matter. A machine can be precise because it is constrained by its structure. A craftsperson can be precise because the body itself becomes a measuring instrument, supported by tools, experience, and constant checking. It is slower, but slower does not mean less intelligent. Sometimes it means more attention is being paid. Consider how a flat surface can be made without modern machinery. You begin by removing obvious high points. Then you check the surface against a straight edge, a reference plane, or another surface. You mark the places that touch first. You grind those down. You check again. You repeat. If abrasive powder is used between two surfaces, the high points wear away more quickly. Over time, the surface becomes flatter. This principle of lapping is simple but powerful. It does not require electricity. It requires abrasive motion and repetition. Making a large surface flat is harder than making a small one flat, but the idea is not mysterious. The problem is labour, control, and measurement. And ancient Egyptians, particularly in royal and temple workshops, had systems for labour, control, and measurement. Interior surfaces are more difficult. A large exterior plane can be worked from many angles. The inside of a stone box forces the worker into a confined space. The deeper the hollow becomes, the more awkward the tool movement. Corners are especially troublesome. Abrasive slurry has to be managed. Waste has to be cleared. The worker must avoid removing too much material from one wall while correcting another. This is where the Serapeum boxes still deserve respect. Even if we accept that abrasives can do the cutting, the practical task remains severe. A rectangular cavity in hard stone at that scale is not a casual object. It represents planning from the beginning. The walls had to be thick enough to survive transport and burial. The interior had to be large enough for ritual use. The lid had to relate to the body. Every stage carried risk. A mistake late in the process would be costly, and granite does not have an undo button, which is honestly inconsiderate of it. Some observers look at the finish inside certain Serapeum boxes and argue that it is too smooth, too even, or too carefully squared to be the result of ordinary hand methods. The cautious response is to ask for measurements and comparisons. How smooth is it exactly? How flat over what distance? How square relative to which reference? Is the surface finished uniformly or only in visible areas? Are there rougher patches near corners or lower surfaces? Are there traces of grinding direction? Does the polish differ from box to box? These questions matter because ore is not a measuring instrument. Neither is disbelief. A surface that feels impossible may become understandable when measured, or if it remains unusual after careful measurement, then the mystery becomes stronger. The point is not to make the object ordinary. The point is to understand what kind of extraordinary it is. Corundum is often brought into the discussion as a possible answer to some of these difficulties. Because it is much harder than quartz, it can abrade hard stone more effectively. If a craftsman had corundum-rich emery, he could grind and polish materials that would defeat softer abrasives. But we have to be careful not to turn corundum into another magic word. Saying corundum does not automatically explain a giant sarcophagus, any more than saying flour automatically explains a wedding cake. There still has to be a recipe, a method, a tool, a sequence, and skilled people. The abrasive must be sourced, crushed, graded, mixed, applied, and used correctly. Coarse grains remove material quickly but leave damage that must later be smoothed. Fine grains polish but remove material slowly. A high-quality finish may require many stages, each one removing the scratches of the one before it. If the worker rushes, the earlier scratches remain. If the surface is uneven, the polish may only make the unevenness shinier, which is a surprisingly common problem in life as well as stone. The idea of graded abrasives is important. Modern polishing often moves through progressively finer particles. Ancient workers may not have described grit sizes in modern terms, but they could still sort materials by experience. They could wash, settle, sieve, crush, and select. They could know which sand worked well for rough shaping and which powder gave a better finish. Craft traditions do not need written charts to recognize useful differences. A potter knows clay by feel. A carpenter knows wood by grain. A stoneworker knows abrasive by the way it bites, slides, clogs, and changes the surface. This kind of knowledge is practical and local. It can be extremely precise without being formally scientific. Science later names things. Craft often learns them first. Precision also depends on the purpose of the object. The Serapeum sarcophagi were sacred containers. They were not ordinary storage bins for grain or spare sandals. Their form and finish likely mattered because they were part of a ritual system connected with divine presence and royal authority. A high level of finish may have been expected not because it was mechanically necessary, but because sacred permanence demanded care. In ancient Egypt, good workmanship could be an act of devotion. The material was not just being shaped, it was being made suitable for eternity. That is a powerful motivation. Modern people sometimes ask why anyone would spend so long polishing stone no one would see after burial. But ancient Egyptian tomb culture often involved enormous effort placed beyond ordinary human view. The intended audience was not only living visitors, it included gods, the dead, and the order of the cosmos. That may sound unfamiliar, but it makes sense within their world. Still, the hidden nature of the Serapeum boxes creates a puzzle. If some surfaces were never meant to be seen after installation, why finish them carefully? There are several possible answers. The first is that they may have been visible during rituals before sealing. The second is that sacred objects could be finished properly because the act mattered, not because tourists would later admire it with flashlights. The third is that some surfaces may be less finished than popular discussion suggests, with the most impressive examples receiving most attention. The fourth is that workshop standards were high because consistency itself was part of the craft. And the fifth is that we may not fully understand the sequence of manufacture and placement. Perhaps some finishing happened before installation, when the object was easier to access. Perhaps some was done after. Perhaps different boxes had different histories. The stone may preserve answers, but only if studied in detail rather than treated as a single uniform mystery. It is also worth remembering that polish can survive in selective ways. A surface protected underground may preserve a finish better than one exposed to weather. But damage, looting, movement, cleaning, and modern contact can alter what remains. A sarcophagus broken open in antiquity may have surfaces that are original, damaged, reworked, or scarred by later tools. When visitors describe what they see, they may be seeing a mixture of ancient finish and later history. This does not invalidate their impressions, but it complicates them. The Serapeum is not a sealed workshop sample. It is a site with a long afterlife. The boxes have been made, used, entered, damaged, studied, photographed, and argued over. Every stage can affect the surface that now becomes evidence. The claim of impossible polish often depends on the assumption that ancient methods were crude. If one imagines the workers as using only rough pounding stones and basic copper chisels, then a smooth granite surface seems miraculous. But if one imagines a full sequence of rough shaping, abrasive sawing, drilling where useful, grinding with coarse abrasives, checking with straight edges, smoothing with finer abrasives, polishing with very fine powders, and repeating across long periods, the result becomes less impossible, though still impressive. The magic is not in a single tool, it is in the sequence. Remove enough material in the right order and the stone changes. Make enough small corrections and the form improves. Use finer grit and the surface softens. Repeat longer than a modern person would prefer, and the object begins to look as though it came from a different kind of workshop. Modern assumptions about time often distort this discussion. We live in a world where efficiency is almost a moral value. If something takes too long, we assume the method is bad. Ancient monumental work did not always operate under the same logic. Labour was valuable, but sacred and royal projects could justify enormous effort. A project that seems absurdly slow to us may have been acceptable within a system organised around religion, kingship, seasonal labour and long-term tradition. This does not mean labour was infinite, or that ancient people wasted effort casually. It means the calculation was different. A sacred sarcophagus for an Apis bull was not competing with email, train schedules, and online grocery delivery. It belonged to a world where permanence could matter more than speed. There is a related danger in assuming that lost advanced technology is the only respectful explanation. Many people who argue for ancient machines do so because they admire the objects and cannot believe simple tools made them. But this can accidentally underestimate ancient workers. The skill of patient hands is not a lesser explanation. It may be the greater one. A machine can produce regularity because it is designed to constrain motion. A human workshop can produce regularity because knowledge has been distributed across people, tools, habits, and checks. That is not primitive. That is technology in its oldest and most durable form. A society does not need steel mills and electric motors to be technically sophisticated. It can be sophisticated through mastery of material, organisation of labour, and refinement of methods that modern observers rarely practice. At the same time, the patient hand explanation should not be used lazily. Saying they had time is not enough. Is not. Time does not polish granite unless someone uses it well. Time does not select abrasives. Time does not design a tool or check a corner. Time does not move slurry across a surface with the right pressure. The real explanation must include people, materials, methods, and quality control. It must take ancient craft seriously as craft, not as vague patience. That is where corundum, quartz, emery, copper, stone pounders, water, measuring cords, straight edges, and trained supervision become part of a practical picture. When the picture is detailed, it becomes more convincing. When it is vague, it leaves room for every speculative machine to roll in through the gap. The question of precision, then, may be less about whether ancient Egyptians had modern machinery and more about whether we have underestimated what a slow, specialised, sacred workshop could achieve. A granite surface does not need an ultrasonic tool to become smooth. It needs a cutting or grinding agent harder than the minerals being removed, a method of applying that agent, and enough repeated motion. A lid does not need a laser level to fit well. It needs careful shaping, checking, and correction. A box does not need a powered mill to have straight sides. It needs a process that identifies error and removes it little by little. These are not glamorous methods, but they are powerful. They are also exactly the kind of methods that can disappear from written history because they belong to workshops rather than royal inscriptions. And yet the Serapeum keeps its uneasy feeling because scale changes everything. A small polished vessel proves skill, but a huge polished stone box multiplies the labour and risk. A hand method that works on a bowl may become exhausting on a sarcophagus. A straight edge that checks a small panel may be harder to apply across a massive surface. A polishing sequence that makes a statue gleam may require extraordinary organisation when applied to a container weighing many tons. The mainstream explanation remains plausible, but not trivial. It asks us to imagine not a few workers improvising underground, but a serious technical tradition supported by a powerful religious institution. That may be the most realistic vision of all. Not a lost factory, but a lost workshop culture operating at a level of discipline that feels almost alien because the world that produced it is gone. The small grains lead us back to the large boxes with a better sense of proportion. Corundum dust, quartz sand, and emery do not solve every mystery by themselves, but they show how hard stone can be shaped without modern cutting edges. Polish does not prove impossible machinery, but it does prove attention. Precision does not always mean digital control, but it does mean measurement, correction, and standards. Patient hands are not a weak force when they are trained, organised, and supported over time. The Serapeum surfaces may still hold unanswered questions, especially about exact methods and stages of work, but the presence of hard abrasives makes the old technology richer than the simple phrase copper tool suggests. Still, just when the physical evidence begins to feel almost manageable, another kind of evidence enters the story. Not a groove, not a polish, not a grain of corundum trapped in an old cut, but writing. Marks made not by tools trying to shape stone, but by people trying to communicate meaning. At the Serapeum, inscriptions and texts connect the underground galleries to kings, priests, sacred bulls, dates, offerings, and rituals. Most belong to the religious and historical world we would expect, but some claims point to a more mysterious inscription, one said to resist translation or to describe a power beyond ordinary language. And if stone surfaces can be misread, ancient words can be misread even more easily, because a damaged sign in a sacred text can become many things in the modern imagination, especially when it is already sitting in a corridor full of granite giants. Writing changes the feeling of an ancient place. Stone can impress us with weight, polish and scale, but writing makes the silence feel more deliberate. A huge granite box can seem like an engineering problem. A corridor can seem like an architectural problem. A tool mark can seem like a manufacturing problem. But a carved sign, even a damaged one, suggests that someone wanted meaning to survive. Someone chose words, arranged symbols, cut them into stone, and trusted that the future would understand. Of course, the future is not always as cooperative as hoped. Sometimes it arrives thousands of years later with cameras, translation debates, and the confident ability to misunderstand almost anything before breakfast. At the Serapeum, inscriptions are not an afterthought. They are part of the reason the site matters so deeply to Egyptology. The underground galleries and the objects found there helped scholars connect sacred bull burials to kings, dates, rituals, and long sequences of Egyptian history. The Apis bulls were not anonymous animals buried quietly in the dark. Their lives and deaths could be recorded. Their burials could be commemorated. Priests and officials could leave stele, names, offerings, dates, and devotional phrases. These texts helped turn the Serapeum from a mysterious set of tunnels into a historical archive, though one written in a language that requires training, context, and a very calm relationship with damaged stone. This is important because modern mystery stories often treat the Serapeum as if it were almost wordless, as if the site gives us only enormous boxes and no explanation. But that's not quite right. The Serapeum is full of historical and religious context. The Apis bull cult, the connection with Ptah and Memphis, the transformation after death into Osiris Apis, the long use of the galleries, the involvement of kings and priests, the commemorative stele, all of these give the site a recognisable place inside Egyptian religion. That does not solve the technical questions about quarrying, cutting, polishing or moving stone. But it does mean the boxes were not found in a vacuum. They were found in a sacred landscape with a written record around it. And yet, writing can create mystery as easily as it solves it. This is especially true when a text is damaged, incomplete, rare, formulaic, symbolic, or removed from context. A missing sign can change a phrase. A religious metaphor can look like a technical description if read too literally. A word meaning power in a divine sense can be mistaken for power in an electrical sense. A title can look like an object. A ritual statement can be pulled into a mechanical theory. Ancient Egyptian writing is not a simple code where each symbol neatly becomes one modern word and everyone goes home feeling refreshed. It is a complex system with phonetic signs, determinatives, ideograms, grammar, convention, religious vocabulary, and centuries of change. It is beautiful, but it is not always gentle with beginners. The claim that an inscription at or connected with the Serapeum is untranslatable, or that it supposedly describes an unknown power source, belongs to this difficult territory. It is the kind of claim that sounds almost made for a late-night mystery, a hidden text, carved near impossible stone boxes, resisting translation, hinting at a forgotten force used to shape granite. You can see why it attracts attention. After the massive sarcophagi, the strange tool marks, the talk of abrasives, and the possibility of lost techniques, the idea of a written clue feels irresistible. It seems to promise the one thing stone alone cannot give, a confession. As if somewhere in the dark an ancient craftsman wrote, "And then we turned on the mysterious device," before politely adding a diagram and perhaps a warning not to touch the vibrating end. But real inscriptions are usually less convenient. The texts associated with the Serapeum are generally understood in religious, commemorative and historical terms. They record the lives, deaths and burials of sacred bulls. They mention kings, priests, rituals, offerings, and the sacred status of the apis. Some inscriptions may relate to construction, dedication, or the preparation of burial spaces. This is exactly what we would expect in a cultic burial complex. If a sacred animal was treated as a divine being and buried with state-level ceremony, people would write about devotion, dates, offerings, and the relationship between gods and kings. They would not necessarily write a practical workshop manual for hollowing granite. Ancient texts often tell us what a thing meant, not how every tool stroke was performed. That difference between meaning and method is easy to overlook. A modern engineer may approach a stone box and ask, "How was this made?" An Egyptian priest may have approached it and asked, "How does this serve the god?" Both questions matter, but they are not the same question. The inscription may answer the priest's question and leave the engineer feeling neglected. That does not make the inscription useless. It simply means it belongs to a different layer of the site. Religion can explain why the work was done. Engineering explains how the work was done. Sometimes the evidence overlaps. A construction inscription may mention labour, time, materials, or transport. But many sacred texts are not interested in satisfying modern curiosity about cutting speeds, abrasive grades, or whether anyone used a particularly clever drill before lunch. The word power is especially dangerous in translation. In modern English, power often makes us think of energy, engines, electricity, fuel, batteries, force output, or something that can be measured in watts. In ancient religious language, power may mean authority, divine potency, life force, sacred effectiveness, royal command, magical protection, or the strength of a god. Egyptian religion was full of concepts that do not map cleanly onto modern technical vocabulary. A god can be powerful without being a generator. A ritual can be effective without being a machine. A sacred object can be charged with divine force in a symbolic or theological sense, without implying an electrical field humming politely under the floor. This does not mean we should dismiss unusual words or difficult passages. It means we have to ask what kind of difficulty we're dealing with. A text may be difficult because it is physically damaged. A sign may be broken away. A surface may be worn, recut, reused, or poorly preserved. A scribe may have used an uncommon spelling. A later copyist may have made an error. A phrase may belong to a religious formula not yet fully understood. The grammar may be obscure, the context may be missing, or the text may be perfectly translatable to specialists, while non-specialists find it mysterious because the published discussion is hard to access. Unreadable to whom is always the first question. Untranslatable by everyone, by one researcher, by a visitor, by a documentary narrator, by someone holding a phone in a dark tunnel, or by a person on the internet with admirable confidence and no dictionary. That question matters because the word untranslatable has a strange glamour. It makes a text sound forbidden, almost alive. But in scholarship, untranslatable often means something much less dramatic. It may mean the signs are damaged. It may mean the reading is uncertain. It may mean the language is known, but the exact meaning is debated. It may mean no specialist has yet published a full treatment. It may mean the text is fragmentary and cannot be restored with confidence. It does not automatically mean the inscription contains a secret too advanced for modern academia. Sometimes an unreadable inscription is unreadable for the same reason a shopping list in the rain is unreadable. The universe has not hidden a cosmic secret. The ink just had a terrible afternoon. The Serapeum's inscriptions are also complicated by the long life of the site. It was used across many periods. Different rulers, priests and devotees left material. Some texts belong to different moments in the cult's history. Some were found in relation to burials. Some stelae were moved, broken or displaced. Some chambers were robbed. Some finds were made during 19th century excavations, when recording standards were not what they are today. This creates room for confusion. An inscription found near a chamber may not always have been in its original position. A text associated with one burial may be discussed beside another. Later visitors may conflate a stela, a sarcophagus inscription, a wall text, and a museum object into one mysterious message. By the time the story has travelled through books, lectures, videos, captions, and retellings, the original location and wording can become blurrier than a photograph taken while walking. Then there is the problem of sacred metaphor. Ancient Egyptian religious language often describes gods, kings, and sacred beings in elevated terms. It speaks of radiance, strength, protection, life, stability, renewal, breath, light, hiddenness, transformation, and the power of divine names. To a modern reader primed for lost technology, words like light, fire, force, vibration, voice, breath, or power can start to sound technical. A god's voice becomes sound technology. Divine radiance becomes electricity. Sacred breath becomes compressed air. A hidden force becomes an unknown energy source. The imagination links words to machines because machines are how our world expresses power. But in the Egyptian world, ritual, speech, writing, and divine presence could themselves be powerful. Words were not merely labels, they were active in the religious imagination. A carved name could preserve identity. An offering formula could sustain the dead. A spell could protect, transform, or guide. That is not engineering, but it is not casual language either. This is one of the hardest things for a modern audience to hold in mind. Ancient religious texts can sound technical because they treat words and rituals as effective forces. They describe actions that produce results, names that protect, offerings that nourish, recitations that open ways, and images that make presence possible. If you read this through a mechanical lens, you may start looking for machinery. If you read it through an ancient Egyptian religious lens, you find a world where meaning, speech, image, and divine order are already forms of power. That does not make the text less interesting. It makes it more interesting, because it reminds us that technology is not the only way human beings have understood cause and effect. Of course, some inscriptions at the Serapeum do include practical information. Certain texts record dates, rulers, lengths of life, burial events, and sometimes details connected with construction or preparation. These are valuable because they show administration behind ritual. A sacred bull's life could be tracked. Its death could be recorded. Its burial could be dated. Work could be organised. This is not the glamorous lost machine version of the Serapeum, but it is powerful evidence of a functioning institution. The cult needed priests, scribes, embalmers, stoneworkers, transport crews, and officials. Writing helped manage memory and authority. A stela could say, "This bull lived under this king, died at this time, and was buried properly." That kind of text does not explain the exact polish on granite, but it explains why so much effort could be directed toward a single animal burial. The more speculative claim of an inscription describing an unknown power source may arise from a mixture of damaged language, symbolic vocabulary, and wishful technical reading. Without a clear published source, exact signs, context, and specialist translation, the claim has to remain a claim. That does not mean it should be mocked out of existence. It means it should be placed gently on the table and asked to show its papers. Where is the inscription? Is it on a sarcophagus, wall, stela, lid, fragment, or object from the wider Serapeum complex? Has it been copied accurately? Is there a photograph or facsimile? What is the accepted Egyptological reading? Which signs are uncertain? What word is being translated as power? Does that word normally mean divine might, royal strength, magical effectiveness, physical force, light, energy, or something else? Are alternative translations possible? Has any trained Egyptologist argued for a technical reading, or is the claim circulating mainly in popular mystery discussions? These are not rude questions, they are the basic manners of evidence. If an inscription truly described a technical process, we would expect certain features. It might name materials, tools, workers, actions, measurements, or sequences in a way that differs from ritual formula. It might use administrative language. It might appear in a workshop, quarry, or construction context. It might be accompanied by scenes of labour or equipment. It might match other texts that discuss craft production. Ancient Egypt did record practical matters when needed. Labour, offerings, inventories, quarry expeditions, temple goods, and royal projects. But a phrase about divine power near a burial is not enough by itself. Context is the lantern in this tunnel. Without it, almost every shadow becomes a secret machine. There is a useful comparison in the way some people read the so-called Dendra light reliefs, another famous case where religious imagery has been interpreted as ancient electrical technology. Mainstream Egyptology reads those images within religious mythology and temple symbolism. Alternative writers see bulbs, cables, and power systems. The debate is not really about whether the shape vaguely resembles something modern. Many ancient shapes resemble modern things if we squint with enough enthusiasm. The debate is about context. What do the surrounding texts say? What do similar images mean elsewhere? How did Egyptians represent gods, serpents, lotuses, creation and light? What does the scene belong to within the temple? The Serapeum inscription claim needs the same discipline. A technical-looking word or image must be tested against the whole Egyptian system, not plucked out like a raisin from a cake and asked to explain the bakery. It is also worth considering why the idea of an unreadable message is so appealing. The Serapeum already feels like a place where the obvious answer might not be enough. The boxes are huge, the stone is hard, the polish is impressive, the underground setting is atmospheric. Add an inscription that seems to resist translation, and the site begins to feel intentional in a new way, as if the builders left a clue that modern experts refuse to read correctly. That is a satisfying story structure. It gives us mystery, resistance, revelation, and the possibility that we, standing far in the future, might understand what others missed. Humans love that kind of story. It makes us feel like late arrivals at a locked door who happen to have the right key. Unfortunately, history often prefers messier arrangements. The door may not be locked, the key may open a cupboard, the cupboard may contain temple accounts, and the mysterious power source may turn out to be a phrase meaning the strength of Osiris, which is still wonderful, but less useful for cutting granite. At the same time, there is a deeper truth hiding inside the confusion. Ancient inscriptions do describe power, just not always the kind modern speculation wants. They describe the power of kingship, the power of gods, the power of ritual, the power of names, the power of burial, the power of order against chaos. In the Egyptian worldview, these powers were not decorative ideas. They structured reality. A correctly performed ritual mattered. A body properly prepared mattered. A name preserved in writing mattered. A sacred animal buried in the right place mattered. If we reduce all power to mechanical energy, we miss the kind of power that actually drove the Serapeum as an institution. The enormous stone boxes were not made because someone wanted to demonstrate a cutting technique. They were made because a sacred system required them. The machine, if we may use that word carefully, was not only a tool, it was the whole religious and administrative apparatus of ancient Egypt, capable of turning belief into stone. That may sound less exciting than a hidden generator, but it may explain more. A powerful temple institution can quarry stone, commission craftsmen, organise transport, record dates, perform rituals, and maintain a burial complex for centuries. It can preserve a tradition long enough for methods to become refined. It can motivate work that would otherwise seem excessive. It can make a giant stone box not only possible but necessary. The Serapeum was powered by religion, kingship, labour, memory and bureaucracy. These are not mysterious energies in the physical sense, but they are real forces in history. They move people, they move resources. Sometimes, quite literally, they move granite. Still, the idea of a difficult inscription should not be thrown away entirely. It should be investigated properly. Ancient Egyptian texts are still studied, revised and debated. New readings can appear. Damaged inscriptions can be re-examined with better imaging. Museum objects can be reconnected to excavation records. A neglected text can become important when someone finally studies it in context. If there is a specific inscription at the Serapeum that has been claimed to describe an unknown force, it deserves a careful, transparent presentation. Show the photograph, show the copy, identify the signs, give the standard reading, explain the uncertainties, compare the vocabulary with other Egyptian texts. Only then can viewers decide whether the claim is a real puzzle or a modern misunderstanding wearing ancient clothing. The danger in the popular version of the story is that the inscription becomes a mirror. People see in it what they already expect. Those who expect advanced machines find power sources. Those who expect only ritual find religious formula. The solution is not to choose the more exciting expectation. It is to slow down. Ancient writing must be read in its own language before it is translated into ours, and then it must be interpreted in its own world before it is made to answer our questions. That is a long process, but ancient Egypt has always rewarded patience. It does not reveal itself well to hurry. Hurry is how one ends up confidently identifying a sacred bull record as a maintenance label for a granite resonance chamber, which would be a bold afternoon for everyone involved. There is also a humbling lesson here about the relationship between text and object. The stone boxes may preserve the physical traces of making, but the inscriptions preserve the social and religious traces of meaning. Neither type of evidence should be forced to do the other's job. Tool marks can tell us about contact, motion, abrasive and finishing. Inscriptions can tell us about names, dates, rituals, titles and beliefs. If a text happens to mention construction, transport or materials, that is extremely useful. But if it does not, the silence is not suspicious by itself. Ancient people did not write for us. They wrote for their gods, their dead, their kings, their institutions and their own future. We are eavesdropping across time, and eavesdroppers must be careful not to mistake a prayer for a blueprint. So where does this leave the unreadable inscription? In a place of cautious interest. It may be damaged, it may be misunderstood, it may be a religious phrase dressed up by modern imagination as technology. It may refer to sacred power rather than mechanical power. It may belong to a broader collection of Apis bull texts that record ritual and chronology rather than machinery. Without clear evidence, it cannot be used as proof of an unknown energy source or lost advanced cutting system, but it can still serve a useful role in the story, because it shows how easily the Serapeum draws different kinds of mystery into itself. The boxes raise engineering questions, the tool marks raise manufacturing questions, the abrasives raise material questions, the inscriptions raise questions of meaning, and together they create a site where every surface seems to ask for another kind of expertise. The most responsible conclusion is not that the inscription reveals a lost machine, but that inscriptions at the Serapeum reveal a culture powerful enough to make the machine unnecessary, in the way the claim imagines. They show an institution that tracked sacred bulls across time, linked them to kings and gods, and placed them in a burial landscape of enormous effort. They show memory carved into stone beside stone shaped by labour. They remind us that the Serapeum was not an abandoned workshop later mistaken for a tomb, at least not according to the strongest evidence we have. It was a sacred burial complex whose technical achievements were placed in the service of ritual. That does not make the stonework easy. It makes the reason for the stonework more human, more organised, and perhaps more impressive. And still, one cannot quite leave the corridor without glancing back at the marks. A written sign may be mistranslated, a tool mark may be misread, a polished surface may be overpraised, a conventional explanation may be too brief, a speculative theory may be too eager. The Serapeum remains powerful because it sits at the crossing of all these uncertainties. It asks us to hold physical evidence and written evidence together without forcing them into a single dramatic answer. It asks us to respect ancient religion without ignoring ancient engineering. It asks us to admit that lost knowledge may exist, but that not every lost thing was a machine. And as the writing fades back into stone, the larger question begins to return. Not whether one inscription unlocks the whole mystery, but what kind of human world could produce these corridors, these boxes, these marks, these records, and this long afterlife of wonder that still follows the granite giants in the dark. By the time we have followed the Serapeum from its sandy entrance into its underground corridors, past the sacred bulls, the granite boxes, the tool marks, the abrasives, and the strange pool of disputed inscriptions, the question has changed a little. At first, it may have sounded simple. Did ancient Egypt have lost advanced cutting technology? But after standing with the evidence for a while, even if only in the imagination, that question begins to separate into several smaller ones. Did the Egyptians know more about hard stone than we sometimes give them credit for? Almost certainly. Did they use simple tools in ways that were more sophisticated than the tools themselves suggest? Very likely. Did they have craft methods, workshop habits, abrasive recipes, measuring practices, or moving techniques that are now partly lost? That would not be surprising at all. Did they have a modern-style machine powered by an unknown energy source, humming in the darkness beneath Saqqara? That is a much larger claim, and the stone has not yet given us enough reason to say yes. But perhaps the reason the idea is so hard to let go of is that the Serapeum feels like the kind of place where a secret ought to be hiding. It is underground. It is ancient. It is connected to gods, death, sacred animals, and enormous objects made from hard stone. The boxes are dark, heavy, and strangely severe. They do not look friendly. They do not look decorative. They look as if they belong to a system with rules we do not fully understand. And when modern people see a system they do not understand, we often reach for the language of machines. Machines are our way of explaining power. Engines move weight. Motors create motion. Diamond tools cut stone. Electronics control precision. If something looks controlled, smooth, regular, and difficult, we imagine a machine behind it, because in our world there usually is one. Ancient Egypt belonged to a different world. That does not mean a simple world. It means a world where power was organized differently. Royal authority could command labor, temples could preserve knowledge, priests could direct ritual, craftsmen could inherit techniques through long apprenticeship. Quarry workers could understand stone through experience rather than through engineering textbooks. Scribes could record dates, offerings, and sacred events. Boatmen, rope makers, carpenters, stone polishers, haulers, supervisors, and surveyors could all contribute to a single object whose final purpose was religious rather than industrial. In that sense, the Serapeum was powered by a system, just not necessarily the system imagined in the more dramatic versions of the lost technology story. Its energy came from belief, organization, skill, time, and the ability of a state to concentrate effort around sacred work. That may not glow in the dark, but it can still move granite. The dream of ancient machines is not foolish by itself. It comes from a real feeling of awe. People look at hard stone monuments, from the Serapeum to the pyramids, to unfinished obelisks and polished statues, and they sense that something is missing from the explanation. Not always something supernatural or impossible. Sometimes just the missing sound of the workshop, the missing gestures, the missing tools in motion, the missing smell of wet stone dust, the missing instruction passed from master to apprentice. Archaeology gives us objects, marks and fragments, but it cannot always restore the living process completely. We are left with the result, and results can look miraculous when the method is gone. A polished granite surface may seem like the footprint of a machine because the hands that made it have disappeared so completely. This is one of the gentler ways to understand lost technology, not as a secret civilization with electric saws and hidden generators, but as lost practical knowledge, a way to hold a tool, a way to mix abrasive slurry, a way to check flatness with a straight edge and a trained eye, a way to move heavy stone using sledges, wet surfaces, ramps, sand, ropes, levers and coordinated teams, a way to organise labour so that slow work could continue long enough to become extraordinary. These things are technologies. They may not impress us at first because they do not look like machines. But a technology is not only a device, it is a repeatable method for doing work. In that sense, the Serapeum almost certainly preserves lost technology, because every ancient craft tradition contains details that were never fully written down and did not survive intact into the modern world. The danger comes when lost method becomes lost super machine before the evidence is ready. The granite boxes do not become proof of ultrasonic tools simply because they are difficult. The polish does not become proof of unknown energy because it is beautiful. A damaged inscription does not become a technical manual because a modern translation sounds mysterious. The responsible path is slower. Look at the marks, measure the surfaces, compare them with experimental cuts. Test copper, quartz, emery, corundum, pounding stones, grinding stones, and polishing sequences. Study the residues, scan the interiors, record the tool traces, check the claims about precision with actual instruments. Ask whether the unusual features are truly unusual, or whether they are impressive examples of known methods used extremely well. The mystery does not shrink when treated carefully, it becomes more useful. In some ways, the most interesting answer may be the least theatrical one. Suppose the Serapeum boxes were made without any advanced machinery in the modern sense. Suppose they were quarried, shaped, hollowed, ground, polished, moved, and installed using materials and principles already known in ancient Egypt. Hard stone pounders, copper or bronze tools, abrasive sand, harder mineral grit, water, sledges, ropes, levers, ramps, careful measuring, and long experience. That would not make them ordinary. It would make them a monument to what skilled human beings can accomplish when a society gives them purpose, time, and support. It would mean that what looks almost impossible from a modern armchair was possible in an ancient workshop, because the people there had knowledge we rarely practice anymore. That is not a disappointing conclusion. It is a humbling one. Modern people often underestimate hand skill because we live surrounded by finished products whose making is hidden from us. We touch smooth glass, flat tables, polished stone counters, metal parts, screens, lenses and machine-made surfaces all day. We rarely see the stages of making. We rarely feel the difference between rough grinding and fine polishing. We rarely spend months correcting one surface. So when an ancient object appears with a finish that resembles modern work, our instinct is to import modern tools into the past. But handcraft can be far more capable than our habits allow us to imagine. A person who has shaped stone for years may see things in a surface we would miss completely. They may feel irregularities through a tool handle. They may hear changes in contact. They may correct flaws before they become visible. Their technology is partly in the tool but partly in the body. The Serapeum also asks us to be careful with the word impossible. It is a powerful word, but it is often misused. Impossible should mean that something cannot be done under the laws of nature or within the available evidence. Too hard for us to imagine quickly is not the same thing. Too time-consuming for a modern budget is not the same thing. Too heavy for a small team is not the same thing. Too precise to judge by eye is not the same thing. The Egyptians lived in a world where monumental stonework had been practiced for centuries. They inherited solutions. They improved methods. They made mistakes. They abandoned projects when stone failed. They succeeded often enough to leave behind a landscape that still unsettles our assumptions. If we call their work impossible too easily, we may be describing the limits of our patience, not the limits of their ability. And yet skepticism should not become laziness either. Saying ancient people were skilled is true, but it is not a full explanation. Skill has mechanisms. It has tools, sequences, materials, and habits. The Serapeum deserves more than a quick reassurance. It deserves detailed investigation because the objects are genuinely demanding. We should want to know exactly how such large interiors were hollowed, how surfaces were finished, how lids were fitted, how the boxes were transported into the galleries, and how much variation exists from one sarcophagus to another. We should want better public measurements and more experimental comparisons. We should want the stone to be studied carefully enough that admiration does not have to depend on exaggeration. Good evidence can make the story more impressive, not less. The idea of a lost machine also has a deeper emotional appeal because it suggests that history is not a straight climb from primitive to modern, and in that at least the instinct is correct. History is not a simple ladder. Knowledge is gained, lost, reinvented, forgotten, and misunderstood. Societies develop remarkable specialties and then disappear. Trade routes collapse, workshops close, languages change, materials become unavailable, techniques that were once ordinary become mysterious. There were ancient achievements in navigation, architecture, mathematics, medicine, metallurgy, textiles, ceramics, surveying, irrigation, and stoneworking that still deserve serious respect. The past was not waiting helplessly for the modern world to arrive and explain itself. It was full of capable people solving practical problems with the resources they had. But respecting the past does not require turning it into science fiction. In fact, sometimes the science fiction version takes something away. It replaces workers with devices, craft with secrets, and a civilization's real achievements with a fantasy of hidden modernity. The ancient Egyptians did not need to be like us to be brilliant. They did not need electric drills to understand stone. They did not need ultrasonic machines to be patient, organized, and precise. Their world had its own forms of intelligence. The Serapeum is more interesting when we allow it to be Egyptian before we make it modern. Sacred bulls, Ptah, Osiris Apis, Memphis, Saqqara, royal patronage, temple administration, craft tradition, and burial ritual are not background decoration. They are the reason these objects existed at all. If there is a secret preserved in the stone, it may be this. Human beings can do astonishing things when meaning and method meet. Meaning alone does not carve granite. Method alone does not explain why anyone would care enough to do it. At the Serapeum, the two came together. The religious meaning of the Apis bull demanded permanence. The technical tradition of Egyptian stoneworking made permanence possible. The result was an underground place where enormous stone boxes were placed not as puzzles for us, but as sacred containers for them. We arrive late carrying different questions. We ask about technology. They may have asked about eternity. Somewhere between those two questions sits the real Serapeum, patient and heavy in the dark. The stone boxes keep secrets partly because they were never meant to explain themselves to us. They were made for a purpose within a world that is gone. Their makers did not carve a full account of the work sequence into the wall. They did not label the abrasives. They did not leave a neat diagram showing how the lid was lowered. They did not preserve the foreman's notes, if such notes ever existed. They left the object. They left the context. They left the marks. That is enough to begin, but not enough to end every argument. So the mystery remains, not as proof of a vanished power source, but as a reminder that evidence is often incomplete, and that ancient skill can be difficult to recognize when it does not resemble our own. The more we look, the more the Serapeum resists simple answers. It is not simply a tomb, because it is also an engineering achievement. It is not simply a technical puzzle, because it is also a religious site. It is not simply evidence for ordinary methods, because some details still invite closer study. It is not simply evidence for lost advanced machines, because the strongest supporting traces for such machines are not there in the way they would need to be. It sits in the middle, where real history often lives. The middle is less dramatic than certainty, but it is richer. It allows us to admire ancient workers, question modern assumptions, test bold claims, and still feel the quiet thrill of not knowing everything. So what should we make of the claim that the Serapeum reveals lost Egyptian technology? The fairest answer may be yes, but not necessarily in the way the phrase first suggests. It reveals technology if we understand technology as skill organized into method. It reveals lost knowledge if we mean the practical details of stoneworking traditions no longer fully preserved. It reveals precision if we define precision carefully and measure it honestly. It reveals power if we mean the power of a temple system, a religious culture, and a state capable of turning belief into hard stone. It does not yet reveal a proven ultrasonic machine, an unknown energy source, or a forgotten industrial age beneath the sands. Those ideas remain possibilities in stories, but not conclusions carried by the evidence we have, and perhaps that is a good place to leave the Serapeum for tonight. Not solved, not dismissed, not turned into a fantasy workshop or flattened into a footnote, but understood as a place where ancient craftsmanship still has the power to disturb modern confidence. The granite boxes are still there, resting in their chambers. Their lids are broken or shifted. Their interiors are empty. Their surfaces hold scratches, polish, and the memory of tools. Around them linger the records of sacred bulls, priests, kings, excavators, tourists, engineers, Egyptologists, and dreamers of lost machines. Everyone brings a question into the corridor. The stone accepts all of them and answers very few. As we come back slowly from the dark galleries of Saqqara, perhaps to a quiet room, a dim screen, or the soft edge of sleep, it is worth noticing how the mystery has changed. It may no longer be simply about whether the ancient Egyptians had a machine. It may be about why we expect machines to be the highest form of intelligence. It may be about how easily we forget the intelligence of hands, the knowledge of materials, the discipline of repeated work, and the strange force of belief. It may be about how a civilization can speak through stone long after its voices are gone, leaving behind not a full explanation, but an invitation to keep looking carefully. And if you have drifted with me through sand, granite, sacred bulls, copper saws, corundum dust, unreadable signs, and the tempting dream of ancient engines, I hope the journey has been both curious and calm. I would love to know what you think. Do the stone boxes of the Serapeum suggest a lost machine, a lost craft, or simply a level of patience we modern people can barely imagine? And where are you listening from tonight, as these old stones settle back into the darkness of Saqqara? If this quiet exploration helped you unwind, or gave you something strange and thoughtful to carry into sleep, I would be ever so grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and shared this little corner of calm with someone else who enjoys history when it whispers rather than shouts. The Serapeum will still be there when morning comes, the boxes will still be heavy, the marks will still be waiting, the inscriptions will still ask to be read carefully, and somewhere beneath the Egyptian sand, stone will keep doing what stone does best, holding its silence long enough for each generation to wonder whether it is looking at the work of ordinary hands, forgotten methods, or a mystery that has not yet finished teaching us how to ask the right question. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are, and may your own dreams tonight be lighter than granite.